Welcome to the $55 million studio. I'm the Pro Wrestle Machine. Use the chapter markers and please remember to like and subscribe. Let's get into this issue. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. August 7, 2000 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. Gordon Solie passes away. Owen Hart lawsuit developments. More by Dave Meltzer. And now, the nationally syndicated wrestling commentator. Here's Gordon Solie, the late Freddie Miller at the start of every episode of Georgia Championship Wrestling in the late 70s and early 80s. Gordon Solie, an icon figure of this industry who announced more pro wrestling matches on television than any man who ever lived, passed away from brain cancer officially on July 28 at the age of 71. Solie was found that morning by his family, and it is being listed as the date of his death. It is believed his death may have taken place as early as late Wednesday night, as nobody heard from him on Thursday, and the house was exactly the same on Friday morning as it was on Wednesday night, when his daughter was over for dinner. Solie's distinctive voice and understated announcing rhythm was the trademark of pro wrestling in the Southeast for more than 2 decades and in some ways the symbol of pro wrestling in the 1970s. He commanded so much respect in the business that he was acknowledged, even for years after it was no longer the case, as the unquestioned best announcer modern wrestling ever had. His ability to give pro wrestling credibility as legitimate athletic competition was the forerunner of today's Jim Ross and made him the premier announcer of the 60s and 70s. His rich vocabulary earned him mainstream respect as a broadcaster, even if the product he was calling wasn't always worthy of such. His underplayed style of selling wrestling was a complete contrast to the modern game. Solie's health had been failing for 4 years, since he finally retired from announcing in 1996 as the host of Ring Warriors, a syndicated version of New Japan Pro Wrestling which aired on Eurosport. Those close to Solie said he enjoyed calling that no-nonsense style of wrestling, which was a contrast to the changes in domestic wrestling. Solie was a believer in pro wrestling maintaining athletic credibility and, at times, particularly in later years, he would show subtle disdain when the product had gotten, in his view, out of hand. His life took a sad turn when his wife, Eileen, better known as Smokey, passed away in July of 1997. Solie's health itself was already going down from lung and liver problems brought on by the years of heavy drinking and smoking. Although he never worked for the company, the WWF honored Solie at some Florida house shows a few years back. Solie recalled sadly in an article written by longtime friend, legendary Tampa Tribune sports columnist Tom McEwen, who referred to Solie as one of the last of the 3 martini, half a pack of cigarette, lunch men, that he awoke one night at 4 a.m. seeing her suffering badly, and she was gone at 5 a.m. every night since that time. He, whether he liked it or not, would always wake up at 4 a.m. almost on the dot, and relive the nightmare. In October, Solie was diagnosed with cancer of the larynx, and the doctors gave him 3 options, 2 of which would have left him with cancer and his famed speaking voice, but not much time left to live. For a while beforehand, Solie was stubborn about his health, seeing what the cancer did to his wife and refused to get diagnosed, not wanting the bad news. He finally got diagnosed after much prodding, and even gave up smoking after some 55 years. He was down to 135 pounds, and was just content to let it take its course as he stated to McEwen just before the surgery, "I have had my 15 minutes in the sun. I got no complaints." Friends of his tried to encourage him, and he took option number 3, having his famed voice taken away from him in an operation in November, attempting to get all the cancer out, an operation he was told would have a 90% chance of success. He took it in stride, as by January he could talk with a voice box and still could communicate through writing letters and sending emails. But the odds didn't work out in his favor. By March he was having occasional blackouts, and was said to have known deep down what the problem was before it being officially diagnosed that the cancer that had taken his wife from him and just recently had taken longtime business partner Hiro Matsuda, had come back and spread to his brain. Intensely private about his personal life, he knew the end was near and didn't want to become a sympathetic character to the public, so asked that his wrestling friends like Don Curtis, Brian Blair, Howard Brody and Lou Thesz keep it quiet, and few outside his inner circle knew until the word got around wrestling over the past 2 weeks. According to those close to the situation, the last thing he wanted was a scumbag promoter to use his failing health to put on a show in his name. He also knew, from experiencing things through his wife, what the end would be like for him, and had looked into and was reading about assisted suicide. Several of his friends got together with him in the past 2 weeks, and a big party was arranged for August 5th at the Sheraton 4 Points in Tampa for all the members of the Tampa area wrestling community. Just as the invitations were about to be sent out, Solie asked his friends not to, saying he just had a funny feeling and said, "I think we'd better hold the party off." The irony is that turned out to be the day of his funeral. Recognizing his place in wrestling history, He talked of late about the future of the craft he at one point mastered, and was high on Ross and considered him his successor as the best announcer in wrestling. Solie also had a special fondness for Mike Tenay because of his knowledge of wrestling. Solie felt if he could have given Tenay coaching, he could be the best of all. As his health failed, Solie talked at times about wanting to sit down and spend time giving Tenay pointers, but things never materialized. The NWA World Heavyweight Champion, a picture of sartorial splendor. On July 26, Ric Flair, who was told of the situation, gave him a call, and he was one of the last people Solie talked with. "I talked to him on Wednesday night as I was coming back from rehab on my shoulder," said Flair, who often socialized with Solie outside the arena as well. He said, "I love you, Rick. I'm glad I got that phone call in. He was really a great guy. So many times I'd fly with him from Georgia TV to Florida. Gordon would down something like 15 bottles of vodka on the trip from Atlanta to Tampa. I think he was the best announcer of them all." Solie, who during his career announced an estimated 25,000 televised wrestling matches, a total it is believed nobody in history could even approach, was found by his family at his home in Newport Richey, Florida. The Tampa Tribune covered his death as the lead story on page 1 2 days later. Even Wynn's largest all-news radio station in the New York market that evening covered his death as the second leading news item, although the story reported that Solie became the voice of Georgia Championship Wrestling when Ted Turner purchased the company. Wrestling 2 is after the mask of the superstar. To many nationally, Solie was best known as the host of Georgia Championship Wrestling and its Sunday Best of counterpart, renamed World Championship Wrestling in 1982 due to its expanding audience and the promotion's attempted expansion from 1973 through 1985. WTCG in Atlanta, now TBS, Ted Turner's Channel 17 in Atlanta, which had gotten the local wrestling franchise just months before the 1972 promotional split and within 1 year was airing 2 different warring companies during a famous promotional war. The station later became the first attempt at a true national cable superstation. As more and more systems picked up the station in the late 70s, the trademark 3 weekly hours of GCW, a 2-hour show taped earlier that day that aired at 6:05 p.m. Eastern Time on Saturday, and a 1-hour highlight show that aired at 6:05 p.m. on Sunday, became the first cable television shows to consistently be viewed in more than 1 million homes, which is why Turner always had a soft spot for the wrestling programming because it was the first show that indicated his vision of making his local UHF station into a national powerhouse was going to succeed. The show peaked nationally in 1981, when it averaged a 6.4 rating for the year, in a time slot that today would be used as an excuse for ratings being bad because the core audience isn't home. But it drew numbers no wrestling show on cable ever approached again until the WWF over the past 18 months. While it is unfair to compare a 6.4 from that era with a similar number today because there are so many more channels and options, and without question the overall popularity of today's Raw far exceeds GCW at its peak, no matter how one views it, being the #1 program on cable television in any era, let alone #1 for most of a several-year run, is an impressive feat. When Dusty Rhodes graduated college, he had offers from 3 professional sports. At various periods of time in the 70s and 80s, the Florida shows he announced were syndicated outside of Florida into some major markets, including New York, and even St. Louis when Sam Mushnick would take a summer vacation from taping television. In addition, many times in the territorial days, when the world champion was coming into a territory, before he arrived, more often than not the taped match building up his arrival as well as his interview for the match would be done by Solie. So even before cable, Solie was somewhat nationally known as the preeminent voice of NWA wrestling and was synonymous to wrestling fans with wrestling in the state of Florida, and later Georgia. By the nature of how it was promoted and how Solie sold it, it was considered the more credible version of a world which had little in the way of credibility. Oh my word. Welch's ear and the entire side of his face are a crimson mask. It is believed the Crimson Mask, Solie's trade name for bloody matches just as the Pier Sixer became synonymous with brawls, dates back to a 1966 match for the Florida heavyweight title involving Lester Welch and Sputnik Monroe, who was pushed as the territory's lead heel with Boris Malenko working the Carolinas. Welch started bleeding from the ear, with the blood flowing all over the side of his face, which Solie described as a crimson mask, from a line he heard as a kid listening to a radio broadcast of a boxing match in the 1930s, that he remembered on the spot, thinking, since the wrestling show was still in black and white in those days, that the description would make it seem like the show was in color. Solie was even more a part of the lives of 2 generations in Florida growing up as the host of Championship Wrestling from Florida from 1960 to 1987, from the days of Lou Thesz as world champion, when Eddie Graham and Boris Malenko had their wars, to the ascent of Jack Briscoe as the top young babyface in the business chasing Dory Funk Jr., to the bombastic days when the territory was built around dusty roads, the ascent of Barry Windham and even Lex Luger, the craziness of Kevin Sullivan until the slow, painful death of Florida wrestling. Championship Wrestling from Florida, once considered the hallmark of wrestling promotions, succumbed, like virtually all the regional operations, by being unable to compete with the big national players, in particular Vince McMahon and Jim Crockett Jr. Finally, Crockett bought the dying territory, tried to run it briefly with little success, closed it down, and Solie was out of a job in a very bitter split. Solie, more than any of the wrestlers, was the public cornerstone of Championship Wrestling from Florida, through both its good and bad periods. Its demise, in many ways, was a business version of the pain he would personally have to go through years later watching his wife succumb to brain cancer while at the same time his own personal health began failing. His whole life was dedicated to wrestling, said longtime friend Don Curtis, who wrestled in Florida and for years promoted weekly shows in Jacksonville, who noted Solie really didn't have a lot of hobbies outside of wrestling. He came up with ideas and programs. He dedicated his life to wrestling. He believed in the product and in what he said. Because people recognized that, they believed him. When he said something, the people believed it was true because they respected him so much. That's all he really wanted to do, was to make it, wrestling, better. Curtis used to joke that in the early days, Solie was so good at his craft that Cowboy Luttrell, who owned the Florida territory in the pre-Eddie Graham days, could bring in the biggest klutz in the world and Solie could still get him over. Wyndham's not quick, he's sudden. Born on January 26, 1929 in Minneapolis and adopted shortly thereafter by the Solie family, he migrated to Florida in 1950 after serving time in the Air Force working with Armed Forces Radio. He was working as a disc jockey, reporter and talk show host for a small Tampa radio station as well as the stadium voice of sprint car and stock car races in the area, jobs he first garnered more mainstream respectability locally in, even if far less visibility, than the wrestling. In the early 1950s, he got hired on as the ring announcer for Luttrell's weekly matches in Tampa for $5 per night, and later expanded his duties to helping with advertising and publicity. He didn't grow up as a wrestling fan, but learned the game during that period and got his break in 1960 when he was hired to announce the weekly television show in Tampa, which the next year was syndicated on videotape throughout the state. Other announcers at the time treated wrestling like a comedy act, Solie said in an interview a few days before his death. When I got the job, I went to Cowboy Luttrell and asked him how he wanted me to handle it. He looked me in the eye and said, "It's like your paycheck. Treat it very seriously." That's what I did ever since. Solie then spent a few weeks training with the wrestlers, in particular Eddie Graham and John Heath, having them stretch him and put him into holds so he would know what every hold was supposed to feel like, and with his knowledge of the anatomy, how he legitimately should sell the pain and psychology of the moves, which he correctly called, sometimes to a fault, to the viewing audience to create the portrayal as a legitimate sporting event. Solie till the end was the last man in wrestling to use the term suplex, like still used in the amateurs, which is the correct pronunciation of the original French word spelled suplex, a word which has since been Americanized from the phonetic spelling pronunciation throughout the rest of the wrestling world. This is the seal of the National Wrestling Alliance, the oldest and largest sanctioning body of professional wrestling worldwide. When you see this seal, you are assured of the finest in professional sports competition. Solie was in many ways compared with Vince Scully, considered the preeminent baseball announcer of the same period. He was anything but bombastic. In a world of weird, he dressed well, was known for his verbiage, and had a style that made the media types who wanted to make fun of wrestling steer totally clear of making fun of him. He low-keyed most things, treated wrestling as a sport, doing anything to tie in athletic credibility to the product, which was the basis of the successful Florida operation, and tried to find a thread of reality to the sometimes goofy angles. As announcer, he was one of the most successful salesmen for the product wrestling had. He could have his arrogance as well. Wrestlers came and went from Florida for decades, but he was always the constant, and considered himself something of the star maker. Once, when Lex Luger, who the Florida company was built around for a year, was signed to a big money contract by Crockett, Solie bragged that he was the one who made Luger, and he just as easily make Ron Simmons, who was being given Luger's spot. In 1971, in what was a monumental angle at a time when such things didn't happen every quarter hour, the area's top ever heel, Professor Boris Malenko was turned on by Dick Murdoch and Rene Goulet to set up his ultimate tag team pairing with legendary rival Eddie Graham. Solie was peeved because they hadn't waited for him to return from his 2-week vacation, as he'd been led to believe, to do the major switch. Briscoe moving in for the lateral press. We may have a new world heavyweight. No, sir. He made the world title seem like, well, the world title, and made the quest for it seem like the chase of the Holy Grail. There is little question that perhaps the most famous NWA title program of that era, the Jack Briscoe 3-plus-year chase of Dory Funk Jr. in the early 70s. The lengthy matches, including frequent 60 minutes matches, popularized one of his famous trademark lines about classic pro wrestling matches, calling them human chess at its finest. Besides the level the two wrestlers took the matches in the ring, the program was so successful because of the aura and importance Solie continually portrayed the title as having and what it would mean for everyone in the state if and when a wrestler who cut his teeth in Florida would get it. His reputation as the best announcer in wrestling picked up steam outside of Florida with his call of the July 11, 1964 match where Hiro Matsuda won the NWA Junior Heavyweight title from Danny Hodge in Tampa. In those days, because world title changes were so rare, Hodge had held the title for 4 years. The tape was sent to many of the NWA offices around the country and aired on numerous television shows. Leroy McGurk, who promoted out of Tulsa and was the booker of the junior heavyweight champion, and was blind, told Solie as he listened to him call the match that it was the first time in years he could see a match. Solie said that was the greatest single moment of his wrestling career. I don't know what to say. The second biggest moment was on May 21, 1995 in St. Petersburg, when WCW inducted Solie into its Hall of Fame at the Slamboree pay-per-view show. It was a very trying period because it was at the very end of his tenure with the company and he was having a hard time coming to grips with a business that was rapidly changing from what he believed in. Solie had been used, due to his image as the Dean of Wrestling Announcers, as he was nicknamed at this point, although actually Lance Russell in Memphis started a few years earlier than Solie, to induct various wrestlers into a WCW Hall of Fame. The selections, which started a few years earlier with the likes of Lou Thesz and Vern Gagne, by this point became very political, and before the show Solie was upset about having to announce the introductions of two of the candidates, John Studd and Angelo Poffo. Poffo, who was a wrestling star in the Midwest, but hardly had a Hall of Fame career, was inducted simply as a favor to his son, Randy Savage. There was also a problem with Studd, who had passed away just 2 months earlier and had lots of friends in the organization and was well liked within wrestling. Studd's big national run was in the WWF and Solie felt it was supposed to be a Hall of Fame for the history of the NWA and WCW wrestling. The business itself was coming off the steroid trial of Vince McMahon and still somewhat engulfed in that controversy. Studd's doctor had just gone on ABC's Wide World of Sports in a much publicized segment a week or two before, and tied Studd's steroid usage to the cancer that claimed his life at an early age. He felt that it was wrong to induct Studd in the Hall of Fame, based on his own personal credibility, more because of the timing being so soon after the news of the nature of Studd's death had been reported in such a national forum as opposed to his being more associated with the WWF. Because St. Petersburg was his home market, he didn't want to give up his credibility one more time, in a business that had none, for these two inductions. Solie finally agreed to do it, because it was his job, but it was the final straw that led to his departure from WCW for good. That night, after inductions of Wahoo McDaniel, Terry Funk, Antonio Inoki, Dusty Rhodes, Poffo and Studd, he was told to stay out there unbeknownst to himself, as there would be one last induction himself. Wrestling legend had it that Solie was unaware of this. He acted shocked, and put on a great emotional performance to the fans that grew up to his voice for generations and actually stole the entire show. That aspect of it was a work, and Solie's reactions were merely doing as he was told. Solie did know about it ahead of time. There was consideration given at the time in WCW to surprising him as a shoot, but under the circumstances, nobody knew what his reaction would have been. It was part of the reason he went on over his objections about Poffo and Studd. But it led to his second proudest moment as he stood there in front of people in his home market giving him a standing ovation, and Lou Thesz told him, "Enjoy it. You deserve it." Well, Dusty, sometimes in any situation where things are not the same as they used to be, you have to just get on with life, and some of us are going to do just that. The week after Slamboree, Solie spoke his mind about the Hall of Fame, and that was the end of his announcing career in the United States. After the blow-up with Eric Bischoff, he had 2 shows left to voiceover, where he made the aforementioned cryptic remark. Even if that had never happened, his time was limited. He told friends that he still worked with the company. He would have quit for sure a few months later when the company did what he'd consider the worst angle ever, where the Giant fell off the roof of Cobo Arena at that year's Halloween Havoc pay-per-view, only to show up later in the show, wrestling Hulk Hogan in the main event. The biggest testament to his personal popularity with the fans was in the summer of 1984, when Vince McMahon bought majority interest in the Georgia Championship Wrestling Incorporated company in something of a hostile takeover, then folded the company itself, but keeping its most important contract, giving it the national exposure for 3 hours on TBS, inheriting the time slot of the most watched wrestling show in the country. Jack and Gerald Briscoe were the first GCW stockholders to sell, frustrated because they could see national promotions were going to be the order of the day, and GCW had already established its touring potential through lucrative tours in Ohio, but both Jim Barnett and later Ole Anderson, who were running the company, didn't want to step on NWA promoters' toes. McMahon had already started his expansion and had no compunction about stepping on toes, and the Briscoes, and then enough other minor shareholders to control a majority interest, seeing what they felt was the future of a company that wouldn't go national fighting one that would, sold their stock to McMahon. There was no inside information in wrestling, so the number of people aware of McMahon buying majority interest in the court battles by Anderson attempting to stop the takeover, which would have been gigantic news today, were unknown to virtually all wrestling fans. It came as a total shock when one day, Freddie Miller was introducing McMahon and Gorilla Monsoon in the famed TBS studios in downtown in Atlanta, and tapes were airing of WWF matches taped in Canada. After the first WWF show aired on July 14, 1984, actually nicknamed at the time Black Saturday, there was a furor from fans nationwide, but particularly in the Southeast. The complaints by and large were not about any of the wrestlers that abruptly disappeared from sight. The complaints, and there were thousands, were that they wanted their Georgia wrestling back, and in particular they wanted Gordon Solie back. McMahon, sensing a major PR problem since Solie's name was in so many of the complaints, and having caused one at the same time when he responded to the criticism by telling the local press that fans would soon recognize the superiority of his national product, responded by saying publicly he was negotiating to bring Solie in. Solie, who was working for so many different regional NWA TVs at the time, so it would have been very difficult to get him to make the move, later told Steve Beverly that McMahon never even made him a serious offer, and that he recognized the comments in the press were merely to placate the wrestling fans in Georgia for the moment. But the phone calls and complaints to TBS were so strong that 2 weeks later, Ted Turner made a decision, which was probably the start of the end of the Turner/MC Mahan relationship, which only lasted 1 year, by adding a third show in the prime time of 7:35 a.m. called Championship Wrestling from Georgia, a new company headed by Anderson, and putting Solie back on the station and creating yet an additional hour of wrestling on the super station that would last more than 10 years. Solie himself expanding outside of Florida, in particular Atlanta, and later leading to other southeastern cities, came more by a series of memorable circumstances in one of the most bitter promotional wars of all time. Indeed, on Thanksgiving of 1972, just before what was traditionally one of the biggest shows of the year in Atlanta, the NWA Atlanta office was suddenly torn apart with a front-page newspaper story about nearly every wrestler but one and virtually every front office employee, very similar to the recent All Japan split, quitting the company. Ray Gunkel, the area's most popular babyface wrestler, was part owner of the promotion, had just passed away after a heart attack suffered after a match with Ox Baker. Ray's wife, Ann, a model, was apparently about to be ousted from the promotion, headed by Paul Jones, not the 70s wrestlers of the same ring name, and was able to rally the troops with the fact that her husband's death may have been avoided had the promotion had proper medical care and vowed to upgrade the working conditions for the wrestlers. She rallied most of the company behind her and started a rival promotion called All South Wrestling. The NWA, as it did at the same, helped Jones out in the emergency, and with Atlanta having no local wrestlers, sent the biggest names from many of the various NWA offices to Atlanta every Friday for super cards to combat Gunkel, and then brought in the feared Bill Watts as booker to start anew and fight one of the most bitter wrestling wars on record. Watts made himself a top heel, built the company around Mr. Wrestling, who had been working in Florida without the mask as Tim Woods, chasing world champion Funk Jr. with consecutive wins over Gene Kiniski, Jack Briscoe, and Lou Thesz on 3 straight Fridays, and the introduction of the man who would become the area's top babyface for most of the rest of the decade, Johnny Walker, as Mr. Wrestling 2 with the Solie coined $1 million knee lift, along with pushing Bob Armstrong, the only major wrestler who didn't leave the established group, as a major superstar as the Fighting Fireman from Marietta, Georgia. Race dropping a knee to the prefrontal lobe of Rocky Johnson. The voice of Georgia wrestling dating back to 1954 was Ed Capral, who was in many circles considered Solie's equal at the time. Capral, like the wrestlers and other office personnel, had a tough decision. He felt slightly closer to Ann Gunkel because of his closeness to Ray. The actual choice to replace Capral was Sterling Brewer, the announcer out of Birmingham, but that only lasted for 6 weeks. On January 20, 1973 at 6 p.m. Solie showed up as the announcer and simply said he was sitting in that week for Brewer. 1 month later, his name was in the open of the show. He remained on the station in that time slot until McMahon took over in 1984. Soon after that, Solie was commuting every Tuesday to Columbus, Georgia to tape another syndicated show that aired in Savannah, Augusta and Columbus, so the NWA group in the smaller markets would have two separate television shows, compared to one for Gunkel, in those weekly towns. Gunkel, who managed to negotiate a slot on WTCG, which became WTBS, at 7 p.m. on Saturdays, following the NWA show went out of business in late 1974, which created the strange, at the time, 2-hour time slot for the weekly GCW wrestling that continued on the station until being canceled unceremoniously a few weeks back. In December of 1976, WTCG was uplinked to a satellite. It was considered no big deal at the time, either in the wrestling industry or the television industry, yet it changed both forever. I've never had a prouder moment in all my years in professional wrestling than to announce that Jack Briscoe is the World Heavyweight Champion. Solie introducing an interview on July 21, 1973 at the WTCG studios in Atlanta, the morning after the famed chase was culminated. As is little remembered about the chase and capture story, the period after Briscoe first won the title and before the famous Dusty Rhodes turn the next summer, which led to another record business period, was the worst period of the glory years of championship wrestling from Florida. Briscoe was only in maybe 1 week of every 4 to 6, and it was harder to program title programs with a touring champion when the champion was almost a beloved native son. Briscoe was actually from Oklahoma, but was always associated with the Florida promotion, where he cut his teeth. Tim Woods was going back and forth to Georgia as Mr. Wrestling, because of the promotion war. The territory was built around Paul Jones as a babyface, which didn't click. I used to drive 60 miles over to the nearest town because we didn't have cable where I grew up, said Jim Ross, who has credited Watts and Solie as the biggest influences on his announcing. No matter where I was on a Saturday, I tried to watch that show. He was a big part of my early foundation. I go into my Solie mode when calling a Triple H versus Jericho or Rock versus Benoit match. Within 2 years, more and more cable companies starting adding Atlanta's Channel 17, and by 1980 Channel 17 had topped 15 million homes nationwide and 1 million of them were watching the wrestling show, the hottest program of the infancy of what is now known as cable television. He's giving him no surcease whatsoever. When promoters were able to bring in some of the wrestlers off the Atlanta television, and it showed a noticeable increase at the gate, wrestling changed forever. Ole Anderson, who controlled the TV, felt the exposure could lead to going national, starting with some successful tours of Ohio, which had been considered the Sheik's territory, although Sheik had left it for dead. Vince McMahon Sr., apparently aware of what was happening, then raided Anderson of some of his top talent, including Paul Orndorff and the Masked Superstar, and the Georgia business locally started faltering, causing dissension among the stockholders. The death of the NWA territorial boundaries was an inevitability by this time, and he would have the national exposure was going to win out at the end. In late 1983, McMahon started the destruction of the system for good. Solie's reputation was such that he was announcing for several different promotions simultaneously, including at various times being the host of Pro Wrestling USA, an attempt that failed by several of the major companies to join forces in the New York market to take on McMahon in 1985-86, and later for Crockett in that market, as well as doing English-language voiceovers of WWC in Puerto Rico that were being syndicated both in that country as well as in the United States. Although Starrcade was the Thanksgiving tradition of the Mid-Atlantic promotion, a company he didn't work for, his reputation was such that Solie was the lead announcers on the early closed-circuit broadcasts. He also hosted Pro Wrestling This Week, a weekly syndicated news show in the 80s. Briscoe goes for the figure 4, but Funk turns it into an inside cradle, 1, 2, 3. Terry Funk has just won the World Heavyweight Championship. As the years went by, maintaining that dignified aura while doing the broadcasts, as the angles got less and less credible, became at first difficult, and then impossible. It became clear that by the mid-80s, as the business was changing, that Solie's performance lacked the focus and inspiration that made him the legend among announcers and garnered his well-known nickname as the Walter Cronkite of wrestling for, among other things, his calls of the 1969 match where Dory Funk Jr. won the NWA title from Gene Kiniski in Tampa, and the 1975 match where Terry Funk beat Jack Briscoe in Miami Beach. At first, he was no longer winning Announcer of the Year awards that had previously been a given. Then he was no longer even considered among the best. Solie began losing jobs in wrestling, blamed more on his work suffering from his drinking than on his refusing to give up his own personal credibility to overhyping, as was becoming the standard of the changing game. He was also having trouble by the late 80s, because of physical problems, including hip surgery, focusing for an entire 1-hour or 2-hour show. A year later, Solie's rep was no longer untouchable. When a series of political maneuvers took place, including Turner approaching Bill Watts with a deal and adding yet another promotion to his Superstation lineup, and embarrassingly for McMahon, the new What show, which only lasted 13 weeks, in a new time slot, was drawing better ratings than the WWF broadcasts in the established time slot, and the two were about to go into business together. At this point, for a brief period, as once Watts was put on, the idea was for Watts to take over McMahon's traditional wrestling time slot on the station. Turner had 3 different companies, all in competition, all on his station. However, Jim Barnett brokered a deal which brought McMahon and Crockett together, with Crockett buying out the rights to McMahon's time slots and also getting exclusivity on the station, which was the key pawn in Crockett's national run, which failed a few years later and led to Crockett actually selling the entire company to Turner. Watts got screwed out of national exposure in the process, caused his plans to promote nationally to go belly up in a hurry, and he quickly sold his company to Crockett about 18 months before Crockett himself went broke. Solie was no longer even part of the Superstation equation at this point, working for Continental Pro Wrestling This Weekend Florida. When Solie got the word about Crockett, who had just taken over Florida, buying Watts, his first words were, "Let's see how long I'll have a job with them. You remember, I've been fired by Crockett once before. I don't know what he's paying for Watts, but I'll guarantee you he's going to be cutting back somewhere." When Crockett bought the Superstation time slot 2 years earlier, just before the change from WWF programming to what was then Mid-Atlantic programming took place, the Saturday Georgia early morning show saw Solie simply announce, "I'll be away on business next week." After 13 years of being the state's, and in many ways the nation's weekend wrestling constant, that was how transitions were handled in those days. Tony Schiavone was host the next week with Solie's name never mentioned again. It was several years after the Crockett's sale to Turner before Solie was brought back to the Superstation in more of an elder statesman-like role. Solie's weekly announcing in Florida also ended at the hands of Crockett, who bought the dying Florida territory and, with the bitterness of the Superstation dismissal, had another falling out. Crockett cut back the weekly TV tapings to bi-weekly tapings of 2 hours each in a cost-cutting measure. Because there were fewer tapings, he felt he could lower Solie's salary because he was only working 26 as opposed to 52 dates. Solie felt since he was doing the same number of shows, that shouldn't be the case, and just like that, after 27 years, he was gone. Solie complained bitterly about the dismissal, noting that after all that time, he didn't even get a Timex watch as a going-away present. Buzz Sawyer just charged the ring after Tommy Rich. You could count on one hand the number of times Solie allowed himself to be physically involved in an angle. The first was actually the first angle he ever announced, on February 16, 1960 in Tampa. Solie was interviewing Dory Funk Sr. when Mike DiBiase charged the ring and threw Solie down to the mat. Once Solie's dignified character was established, it was literally decades before another physical angle with him was done in Florida. The second was believed to be in 1977 in Atlanta when he stepped into the ring to commentate on an in-ring workout of Mr. Wrestling 2 and Nick Bockwinkel and Bobby Heenan, setting up an AWA title match, Attack 2, and in Going Berserk, 2 mistakenly knocked out Solie. The idea was reprised years later nationally when Roddy Piper, as a face, tried to hit Ric Flair with a chair but instead hit Vince McMahon in 1991. Later, he allowed Sir Oliver Humperdinck to cross the magical line and choke him out on Florida television to get Humperdinck over strong as a heel manager. The most famous was shortly after hip replacement surgery, when Don Morocco bumped him slightly to set up Roddy Piper, who, unlike the legend created by Jesse Ventura, was the one who popularized nationally the heel color commentator role, turning babyface in Atlanta in 1981. After the Florida dismissal, Solie's announcing duties were limited to Continental Championship Wrestling based in Alabama, a job he first started in September of 1975. In April of 1988, after much criticism of his work and in a cost-cutting measure with a faltering territory carrying a high-priced announcer, he announced at the end of a broadcast, "I'll be away on business next week. We've got to get some order restored." His schedule on Saturdays was hectic during most of that glory period. The Florida show was, in its glory days, taped on Thursdays, which made no sense geographically since the wrestlers worked Tampa house shows every Tuesday and had to make the long drive from Miami Beach on Wednesday, stop in Tampa for TV on the way, and then work Jacksonville on Thursday night. The Atlanta show was traditionally taped from 10 a.m. to noon on Saturday mornings, since Atlanta ran its house shows in those days on Friday nights, and thus the national talent flown in for the big shows would already be in town. He'd have to do interviews and wraparounds as well as some slots for the Sunday Best of Show, so he'd usually get out of the Atlanta studios at 1 p.m. making plane connections to Dothan, Alabama, where he did a live show on Saturday afternoons at 5:30 p.m. Central Time. Weren't easy, because he'd have to transfer through Columbus, Georgia or Birmingham. More than one occasion, I would literally be walking into the studio as the opening music was playing at WTVY, The Dothan station which the Southeastern show was syndicated out of before syndication was moved to Birmingham, and I wouldn't even have an idea what was on the lineup until I sat at the desk. Solie recalled from that period. The show was live, and you did what you had to do. He resurfaced as a part owner, and of course as the voice, of a new Florida promotion with Mike Graham, Steve Kieran, himself and later Dusty Rhodes. Rhodes and Solie were intertwined in the minds of every wrestling fan in Florida during the 1970s, where they were the stars of the show, as well as in Georgia, where Rhodes was the top draw when he'd fly in from other territories for the major events. While the two would joke about their Howard Cosell/Muhammad Ali perception from the public, the two were not friends off television. Solie was never part owner of the CWF promotion, although legend always had him in that position. Solie later recognized the story of him being part owner of the company during its glory years was created and spread by Eddie Graham, so no promoter would attempt to steal Solie from Florida because of his value to the company. By this time, Solie's announcing had declined to where he wasn't even considered for any awards, and was used largely because he had maintained legendary status in Florida, built around the famed Solie-isms mentioned in last week's issue. 5 letters. 2 words. I quit. After Crockett sold to Turner, there was a movement by many people who had been friends of his that worked in the organization to bring him back to WCW in 1989, first simply to do a weekly wrestling news feature for an attempt at a primetime Friday night show called The Power Hour, and stayed with the company until the 1995 breakup under Eric Bischoff. The alcohol had taken its toll by this point. They used to fly him up from Tampa to Atlanta the night before he would do his voiceovers, let him sleep off the previous night, and have him do the bulk of his work in the morning. Experience taught them at this point that flying Solie in from Tampa in the morning and scheduling him for afternoon voiceovers was to invite production delays based on his time spent in the Crown Room. His final tenure was highlighted by hosting 5 Clash of the Champions specials with Jim Ross. Most notable was the November 15, 1989 New York Knockout show headlined by the legendary Ric Flair vs. Terry Funk match, where he made famous the line 5 letters. 2 words. I quit, to hype the match, which at the time was the second most watched wrestling match, trailing only a January 1988 WWF USA Network live broadcast of a Royal Rumble, ever on cable television. He started also doing Ring Warriors in 1993, a syndication effort for Europe, working with Howard Brody and Matsuda. Solie told friends he liked doing the shows because the matches were longer and thus he could tell stories with the matches, and less gimmick-oriented, and thus he didn't feel embarrassed by being involved with the product. Funeral services for Solie are scheduled for August 5 at the First Baptist Church in Tampa. The family is requesting, in lieu of flowers, donations can be made to either Hospice of Pasco County and/or the Florida Sheriff's Youth Ranch. And so long, from the Peach State of Georgia. Solie, one of only 5 play-by-play announcers in the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame, and had 5 children, including son Greg, who for several years worked as both a television producer and director for several different promotions. It was also survived by 7 grandchildren, 4 great-grandchildren, and in the minds of millions of wrestling fans who will likely reminisce at various times throughout the rest of their lives to a wrestling match from that period and still remember the distinct voice of Solie making the call. Editor's note: I want to thank Steve Beverly and Scott Teal in particular for help in this story. The crazy antics involving the Hart family and the lawsuit involving the death of Owen got even stranger when defendants in the case accused the prominent Kansas City law team representing Martha of attempting to buy off witnesses by sharing with them the proceeds of any recovery. According to an article in the July 29 Kansas City Star by Dan Margolis, Gary, and Anita Robb, Kansas City lawyers with a national reputation in personal injury law are accused of entering into an agreement with some of Owen's brothers and sisters, who could be major witnesses in the case but have no legal right to share in any recovery under the Missouri wrongful death statute, which only allows a deceased's surviving parents, wife and children to be plaintiffs. The agreement, signed by 5 of the 10 surviving children, stated that siblings who signed the agreement would share in any portion of the award given to Stu and Helen Hart, provided that both parents pass away before the case is settled. The case is strange because it is a family split apart in the Martha Hart/WWF war over the death of Owen, as some of the family members who failed to sign the document either have spouses or themselves have direct or indirect business dealings with the WWF. Davey Boy Smith, who is now in the process of going through a divorce from Owen's sister Diana, and Jim Neidhart, who is married to another sister, Ellie, who has been the most vociferous defender of the WWF and is actually directly responsible for this agreement going public after revealing it to WWF attorney Jerry McDevitt. Bruce Hart, who runs Stampede Wrestling, has also had many talks about running a joint show with the WWF. A first show was already set up for May, but was then postponed due to negative publicity in the community since it was proposed as a show for Stu's 85th birthday and to honor Owen, but Stu publicly said after it was announced that he wanted no part of it, and Martha said she wouldn't support such an effort and felt it to be in bad taste. The Robs have denied any wrongdoing and claimed the agreement was nothing more than an effort to secure unity among members of the Hart family. The agreement was rescinded when McDevitt learned about it when Ellie Neidhart sent him a copy. The lawyers for Martha Hart learned Neidhart had given the WWF a copy of the document when they used information in depositioning of Helen Hart. Robs, during the deposition, claimed it was attorney-client privilege, and that the WWF should have returned it, and Long at first ordered the information to be sealed. The WWF then moved, or an order compelling witnesses to answer questions about the agreement and for it to be unsealed, which Long then granted on May 31st. The Robs claimed the agreement allowed the siblings to have some interest in the proceeds of a recovery, thus would make them less likely to be tricked into pursuing a quick and cheap settlement by the WWF. But Leonard Frischer, who represents the city of Kansas City, a co-defendant along with the Riggers, several manufacturing company of the rigging equipment, and the WWF, in the suit contends the agreement stated the siblings would be entitled to recover whether or not Stu and Helen both passed away before the case was finally resolved. The Robs wrote in court documents that nothing in the agreement even hints that the signatory siblings are under any obligation to testify falsely or evasively. It merely provides that they shall help the plaintiffs and not help the defendants. The document signed would have required Owen's siblings to cooperate with one another and refrain from cooperating and communicating with the defendants, and stated any siblings who did cooperate with the defendants would not be eligible to share in any recovery if the parents were to pass on before completion of the trial. Several of the siblings did not sign the document. Several legal experts in the story questioned the document, even saying it smacked of an illegal inducement of witness tampering because it gives witnesses a financial interest in the outcome, according to Steve Lubet, a law professor at Northwestern. In Missouri, only expert witnesses can be paid for their testimony. The Robs also claim the WWF has been trying to reach a separate settlement with Stu and Helen Hart. Doing so would end the lawsuit because Missouri's wrongful death law treats everyone in such a suit as a single class, so a settlement with any of the parties in the lawsuit bind all of the parties to the settlement. The most important testimony by family members is believed to involve exactly how many more years Hart would have wrestled with the WWF, which directly affects the issue of lost earnings and compensatory damages. The Robs have indicated they will say Hart, who was 34 at the time of his death, would have wrestled for 8 to 15 more years and claimed he would have averaged $750,000 per year, meaning lost income of $6 million to $11.25 million. Since the Supreme Court ruling stated punitive damages must bear a reasonable relationship to compensatory damages, the issue of how many more years Hart would have wrestled also weighs heavily on that potential award. Family members in many media outlets stated that Hart was only going to wrestle for a few more years before retiring, indicating that he was hating what the business had turned into. Hart himself, when he was younger, in a very prominent news story, talked about retiring from wrestling at the age of 30. Ironically, Bruce Hart, who failed to sign the document and may not be a beneficial witness to his parents and sister-in-law, was the one family member directly after the death to say that Owen didn't hate wrestling as much as the others were stating, pointing out he wouldn't have been so good at it if he did, and that after his contract expired, when the new one with all the money was put in front of him, he believed that Hart, like nearly anyone else in the same situation, would not have turned down the money and continued. The defendants charged the document as witness tampering, which according to the story, if proved, could lead to disciplinary sanctions including the Robs being removed from the case or even disbarred. The Missouri Court of Appeals is expected to decide whether or not to unseal the document once again and allow the attorneys for the defendants to pursue questions about the document in depositions with members of the Hart family. The documents in question were originally sealed by a court order at the request of the Robs, claiming attorney-client privilege, and they claim the documents were improperly obtained by the defendants. The trial judge, Douglas Long, Jr., ordered the documents unsealed and authorized the defendants to investigate them on May 31st. On July 5, the Court of Appeals granted the Robs' request to reseal the documents pending further review, but in the interim, they were leaked to the Kansas City Star. Anita Robb said the WWF has tried to divert attention from the major issue at stake, the death of Owen Hart, noting the company even sued the widow, Martha, and her children for breach of contract. WWF claimed Owen's contract specifically stated that any legal action regarding his contract would have to be taken in Connecticut, and the WWF claimed, in asking for a change of venue that wasn't granted, that Owen's contract was breached when Martha filed suit in Missouri. The Robs have since rescinded the agreement after the defendants found out about it, claiming they didn't want the agreement to become a red herring that would distract from the major issues of the case. The World Wrestling Federation's entree to national politics started this past week with them airing footage of the Republican National Convention on Raw, an appearance by Dwayne Johnson scheduled for August 2nd at the convention, and announcing a voter registration campaign. On the same Raw episode, which saw 8-year-olds outside the Georgia Dome chanting "Save the Hose," portrayed by announcer Jim Ross as an exercise in freedom of expression, Linda McMahon spoke in nearly ominous tones about 14 million voters that watch pro wrestling and will decide who wins the presidential election in November. According to one high-placed WWF source, basically two different things merged into one. The WWF was already planning its Get Out the Vote type of campaign when Johnson received the invitation late last week to help open a session with Speaker of the House Dennis Hastert of Illinois, who, ironically, is considered the strongest proponent of amateur wrestling in Congress, which no doubt will ruffle some feathers in that community. On the July 31st Raw show, there were several cutaways purported to be live, actually they weren't, with Linda McMahon and Michael Cole talking about setting up voter registration booths in various places, including at WWF live events. McMahon talked about her dealings with various high-ranking members of the party and said she would also be at the Democratic National Convention. From both parties' standpoints, the WWF's core audience of voting age, because their strongest demo remains male teens, males 18 to 24, vote in unusually low proportions, and the major parties have a difficult time in relating to them. Using one of the biggest celebrities in the country within that demo, Johnson, is clearly a way for the Republicans to try and portray themselves as hip and relevant to younger voters who certainly would in large proportion see them in a more indifferent light. Since everything on a live pro wrestling show in some form or fashion is an angle, it isn't clear exactly what the ultimate purpose of this is. One can speculate that the WWF is trying to use its fan base as a lobbying group similar to the NRA, since there were very much implied threats about the strength of 14 million voters to the politicians in both the cutaways and a television commercial that aired during the show. The 14 million eligible voter figure is a total work, as to get to that number, one has to add up the total viewership over the age of 18 of every single WWF television show in a week. Actually, for the week of July 25th to July 31st, that total would only get the numbers up to 12.6 million, and that counts adults who watch multiple shows as separate voters for every show they watch. Certainly the average hardcore WWF fan watches 2 or 3 shows, some diehards as much as 6, every week. In addition, a very large percentage of the television wrestling audience is not very serious about the product and watches it more as a mindless diversion, and much of the merchandise sales skew very young, much younger than voting age. A more realistic figure of eligible voters would be to take the most watched show Raw and look at the total audience of those over the age of 18. For July 31st, that figure would have been 4.6 million, and there are some hardcore WWF fans that are voting age, that because of work or other commitments, that don't watch Raw. Even so, it's doubtful you could push that legitimate figure up past 5.5 million as far as people who are serious WWF fans, and really that's including casual TV viewers who watch WWF programming as opposed to people who would be categorized as strong WWF fans. It is true that the WWF has tremendous power over its viewership in creating characters and responses to characters, and is more effective at doing similar things and garnering strong reactions than the political parties, whose basic goals are somewhat similar to creation of characters and selling them to the public. Certainly a program that encourages very young children to chant "Save the Hose" and the avowed platform on many issues of the Republican Party are direct contradictions. Certainly, at the very least, encouraging wrestling fans to act as a lobbying group, and the media will report that 14 million figure to the point it will be accepted among politicians as being a real number, has the power to scare politicians that might think of enacting either regulation of the pro wrestling industry, or even the television industry with regulations that would pertain to pro wrestling programming. According to another WWF official, the goal of this campaign is to be bipartisan, but inform the wrestling fans that as a group their voice is powerful. It was specifically stated this would have nothing to do with Bob Backlund's campaign for the U.S. House of Representatives. Clearly the power of wrestling fans in close elections has been felt at least twice, and maybe more, in the 1968 presidential election where Richard Nixon beat Hubert Humphrey in one of the closest elections on record, where among numerous Nixon campaign strategies was to target the huge audience and believed to be easily manipulated audience at the time that watched pro wrestling in the South. And of course last year's election of Jesse Ventura as governor of Minnesota in another close race. Without question, it was also the wrestling fan vote that elected Antonio Inoki into the national diet in Japan in 1989. Still, the claim that WWF fans will decide the outcome of the presidential race in November can only be garnered through the WWF, as an organization, supporting a candidate and throwing its weight behind into many political issues. While it no doubt will be reported that Johnson's appearance was the first by a pro wrestler at a national convention, that wouldn't be the case. Although he won't be attending, Ric Flair was also invited to the Republic Convention as guests of the family of South Carolina Governor Carroll Campbell, although not invited to speak at the convention. Raymond Wagner, Gorgeous George, actually helped open either the 1952 or 1956 Republican Convention, and Jack Atkinson, Fritz von Erich, attended many Republican conventions in the 70s and early 80s as part of the religious right wing of the party. In their day, both Frank Gotch and Strangler Lewis were also brought to conventions due to their friendship with powerful people and mainstream celebrity status. Gotch was invited to the 1912 presidential inauguration and was considered a powerful political force at that time in the state of Iowa. Paul Bosch of Houston was a longtime friend of President George Bush and attended his inauguration, and Bush at one time invited Flair, who was his favorite wrestler, to the White House. Lewis was invited to at least 2 national conventions and was an invited guest at the White House by President Calvin Coolidge. The announcement of Johnson attended the convention brought out an immediate response from L. Brent Bozell III, the chairman of the PTC, saying The Rock uses obscene and profane language as well as has used metal chairs, a shovel and a sledgehammer as weapons during his scripted matches, as well as frequently making demeaning comments toward women. It is unconscionable that one of America's major political parties would give a prime-time platform to someone who encourages young children to behave in such a violent and vulgar manner, he said in an AP story. The PTC on August 1 then urged George W. Bush to withdraw the invitation to Johnson to address the convention the next day, using Bush's statement saying, "Children deserve clear, straightforward messages about right and wrong. All of us, in our public and private lives, should help foster civility and champion positive messages." Bozell was critical in particular of the Poontang Pie comments by Rock, which have been marketed in a t-shirt. The claim is the values promoted by Johnson contradict those espoused publicly by Bush. The PTC claimed that Hastert had told them on Tuesday they've received many calls and have contacted staff members in Philadelphia to alert them to the concerns. New Japan Pro Wrestling ran its first ever pay-per-view show on July 30th at the Yokohama Arena, and little can be said about its success or failure until the numbers come in. As a live event, it was a huge success financially, as they sold 18,000 tickets, some 2,000 of them standing room, and did huge merchandise sales. From live witnesses, it was the largest crowd ever to see wrestling, or perhaps any entertainment event, in the building, with the gate likely in excess of $1.75 million. Currently in Japan, the pay-per-view universe is slightly more than 2.2 million, and they are aiming to hit 3 million before the World Cup soccer tournament in 2001, which they believe is their biggest tool to sell satellite dishes and tuner boxes. The problem with the Japanese mindset as it regards pay-per-view is that regular television, in particular the big networks, are so strong that many people are having a hard time accepting the idea of paying money to watch something on television. The biggest pay-per-view event in the history of Japan was the May 1st Pride show headlined by Hoist Gracie vs. Kazushi Sakuraba, which legitimately did 40,000 buys, which would at the time would have been about a 2.0 rate. But most of the pay-per-view shows from the smaller companies and the WCW events, ECW and WWF, are not on Japanese pay-per-view, have done in the range of 3,000 buys. All of the production and broadcasting were handled by the TV Asahi crew, so the same pay-per-view footage will be edited down for television of the event starting on August 5th. The show was built around Riki Choshu vs. Atsushi Onita, which, with Choshu coming out of retirement after 2.5 years, it was a hot ticket. As expected, it wasn't much of a match, as Choshu, for credibility's sake, pretty well destroyed Onita and never took any shots into the barbed wire cage. Overall, it was considered a terrible main event with a so-so undercard. We'll try and give a full report hopefully in the next week or two after getting the tape. 1. Shinya Makabe beat Hiroshi Tanahashi in 9:33 with a Boston Crab submission. Said to be a typical solid opener but not much heat. 2. Minoru Tanaka beat Akira Hirosaki Nagami in 10:30 with an armbar submission, which actually would mark the first high-profile match where a junior heavyweight cleanly beat a heavyweight and was said to be a good match. 3. Junji Hirata pinned Kenzo Suzuki in 10:13 with his machine suplex after a lariat. Said to be poor. 4. Shiro Koshinaka pinned Koji Kanemoto in 11:40 of another heavyweight versus junior heavyweight match with a back suplex and a power bomb. Said to be the best match on the card. 5. Takashi Iizuka beat Shinjiro Otani with a choke sleeper in 11:04 of another heavyweight versus junior heavyweight match, which was said to have been good, with Otani looking impressive. 6. Yuji Nagata and Kensuke Sasaki beat Yutaka Yoshi and Manabu Nakanishi in 1823. They ran an angle breaking up G-eggs with Nagata feuding with Yoshi. Said to be a good heated match with Nagata against Nakanishi being the highlight. Yoshi was said to clearly be out of his league with the other three. After Sasaki delivered a lariat, Nagata pinned Yoshi with a bridging back suplex. There was a 30-minute delay as they set up the ring for the electric explosive barbed wire match. 7. Riki Choshu, meet Suo Yoshida, pinned Atsushi Onita in 8-12 of their first ever meeting. It was said to have the most volts of electricity of any such match in history. The hype was that Onita, who came into the match with a world record 1,273 stitches on his body, was going to top the 1,300 mark before the night was over. The official battle toll when the night was over was he succeeded, ending the night with 1,322 stitches from his wrestling career, taking 43 in the arm and 6 in the back. Onita, who had to have painkillers shot into his arm and knees just to work the match, came out smoking a cigar. Choshu whipped Onita into the barbed wire immediately for an explosion. Choshu slammed and kicked Onita and whipped him into more barbed wire for a second explosion. Onita came back with 4 low blows, but Choshu barely sold them. Onita's arm was bloody by this point. Choshu blocked Onita's favorite DDT and made a comeback, sending him into the barbed wire for 2 more explosions. Choshu caught Onita in the Scorpion Deathlock, but Onita made it to the ropes for a break, but that led to another explosion. Selling the strength of the hold was such that the hold meant more than being blown up. Choshu then put the Scorpion on in the middle of the ring, and ref Masao Hattori stopped the match when Onita passed out. Onita went out on a stretcher and was taken to the hospital. Choshu, 48, whose retirement show was on January 4, 1998 at the Tokyo Dome, at which point he vowed if he were to ever return, it would only be because the company was in bad shape. After the match said this was going to be his one and only comeback match. Tatsumi Fujinami afterwards indicated it as a possibility to try and get Choshu to wrestle again on October 8 at the Tokyo Dome. There is a feeling within New Japan that Choshu's incredible reaction and the speed this show sold out indicated he's become almost an Inoki-like legend, and that there is big box office for a match with the older legends, Fujinami and Choshu, in a tag team against Shinya Hashimoto and Naoya Ogawa, and perhaps even use Seiji Sakaguchi next year as well when the company does its 30th anniversary show. Onita said he would retire by the end of this year but still wanted to do an explosive barbed wire match in the United States before retiring, and apparently is attempting to put together something with XPW for October. K1 announced the most elaborate tournament in its history, which will culminate in the annual World Grand Prix show at the Tokyo Dome in December. The tournament started with first-round matches on July 30th in Nagoya, where Ernesto Hoost and Jerome Labanner advanced. It continues with more first-round matches on August 20th at the Yokohama Arena and October 9th in Fukuoka at the Marine Meki. There are also tournaments coming up in Croatia, South Africa and the United States, with the latter taking place at the Bellagio in Las Vegas on August 5th. The Las Vegas show will be headlined by a one-night tournament with first-round matches of Andre Dudko vs. Roman Reutberg, Jean-Claude Luyar vs. Paul Lalonde, Jason Johnson vs. Thomas Kusharzewski and Grayug Fitoza vs. George Randolph. The show will also feature a series of prelim matches which will include Kung La, who is the biggest drawing card in San Jose, who fights San Shao, which is a combination of kickboxing with wrestling takedowns, similar to shoot boxing in Japan, and Alex Gong. The Yokohama show has the rematch with Peter Aerts vs. Cyril Abidi, stemming from the upset knockout a few weeks back, plus German Frank Otto vs. Ray Sefo, Matt Skelton of England vs. Alexei Ignatov, and Japan's Tsuyoshi Nakasako vs. Brazil's Francisco Filho. The final first-round tournament in Fukuoka has Andy Hug versus the winner of a September 1st tournament in Croatia, Stefan Liko against the winner of the September 3rd tournament in South Africa, Hiromi Amada against the winner of the Las Vegas tournament, and Mirko Krikop, who went to the finals last year, going against probably a runner-up from one of those tournaments. Paced by uncharacteristic growth for a main event of Rock and Lita versus Triple H and Trish Stratus, while the ratings overall were at average levels, the main event wasn't that far off record levels. Going head-to-head with the NFL Monday Night Football preseason debut of Dennis Miller, which drew what was considered a disappointing 7.26 rating and 13.3 share, down 13% for last year's preseason opener, which didn't have the hype associated with Miller's debut attached to it. Raw ended with a 6.39 rating, 5.75 first hour, 6.96 second hour, and a 10.2 share. Nitro drew a 2.66 rating, 3.01 first hour, 2.35 second hour, and a 4.2 share. The total wrestling audience was 9.5 million viewers during the competitive period, which was actually a lower total than the main event drew on its own. The Raw main event drew an 8.46 overrun with a 15.4 share, which translates into 9,965,000 viewers, making it the fifth most watched wrestling match in the history of cable television. The top four are in June 28, 1999 match with Undertaker vs. Austin at 10,721,000, the May 1, 2000 match with Rock vs. Shane McMahon at 10,576,500, the May 10, 1999 match with Rock and Austin and Vince vs. Undertaker and Shane at 10,452,000, the April 24, 2000 match with Benoit and Triple H vs. Rock and Jericho at 9,984,000. Nitro, which showed a very strong pickup after the football game ended at 9:52 p.m. Eastern, did a 3.11 for the Booker T vs. Sting title match. Where Nitro got clobbered by a 3-1 basis was a three-way tag title match, the Viagra on a pole match and the women's hardcore match. The head-to-head quarters saw Raw at 4.62 X-Pac and Dog vs. Blackman and Snow, to 2.45, Sting vs. Jarrett, Raw at 5.93 Triple H, Stephanie Soap Opera, to 1.86, Chronic vs. Vampiro and Muta vs. O'Hare and Jindrak, beginning of Kidman vs. Douglas, Raw at 6.22, ending of Triple H, Stephanie interview with Foley out, Edge and Christian vs. Hardys, 2.03, ending of Kidman vs. Douglas, Hancock vs. Guns, and Raw at 5.63, Dudley's vs. Angle and Benoit, to 2.63, Steiner vs. Nash, beginning of T vs. Sting. The actual audience overrun for the July 24th Benoit and Angle vs. Rock and Kane match was 9,810,000 viewers, which was an 8.35 rating, which was a whopping 15.4 share, putting it in 7th place among the most watched matches in the history of cable. SmackDown on July 27th was up to a 4.78 with Rock vs. Angle on top. Thunder on July 26th drew a 2.56 rating and 4.3 share, which is slightly up from what the show has been doing in recent weeks. The ratings pattern showed the signs of a decent show as the audience grew early, peaking at 2.93 for Vampiro and Muta and basically holding steady for the rest of the show. Goldberg interview did a 2.80, which is a better pattern than Thunder usually does as it generally drops its audience in the second hour. Other weekend numbers for July 29th to 30th were Livewire at 1.1, Superstars at 1.5, Heat at 3.24 and WCW Saturday Morning at 0.8. ECW on July 28th drew a 1.0 rating, which is its best mark in a couple of months. The July 25th Lucha Libre block on Galavision drew a 1.8 Hispanic rating, a correction from last week. The rating for WCW Saturday Morning Show on July 22nd was in 0.64, which rounds down to 0.6 as opposed to the 0.7 listed here last week. SmackDown on July 20th drew a 4.43 rating while Thunder on July 19th drew a 2.44 rating which actually rounds down to 2.4, not the 2.5 listed, and Sunday Night Heat on July 23rd drew a 2.65. Mexico. The August 4th pay-per-view with Pierre Roth Jr., Mascara Ano 2000, Villano 3 and Pero Aguayo with the Ultimate Loser getting his head shaved will be the first cage match at Arena Mexico in probably 10 years. The last was a match between the original Kamala and Mil Mascaras. Felino's broken jaw actually came from a backstage fist fight with Black Warrior that he came out on the losing side of. Dr. Wagner Jr. has apparently agreed to lose his mask before the end of the year to Rayo de Jalisco Jr., which would be, along with Atlantis vs. Villano 3 earlier this year, one of the two biggest matches of the year in Mexico as far as mainstream interest. They started the feud on July 28th in a match where Wagner unmasked Rayo, but the ref missed the mask coming off and Rayo laid down to cover his face and ended up being pinned. After Rayo got his mask back on and got up, he issued a challenge for a mask versus mask match. Pero Aguayo Jr. turned heel with his first match on the Rudos side being July 30th in Nuevo Laredo, teaming with Abismo Negro and Electroshock against Caneca and Latin Lover and La Parca Jr. The new GWAS promotion is putting on a show in Mexico City at the Palacio de los Deportes, 30,000 capacity, and has announced Jake Roberts, Marty Jannetty and Doink the Clown is coming in. All Japan. In something of a surprise, Motoko Baba, and not Toshiaki Kawada, was named new president of All Japan on July 31st. Monokia Mossman will be undergoing a name change. New tour starts August 20th at Korakuen Hall with Kawada and Genichiro Tenryu and Nobutaka Araya vs. Stan Hansen and Mike Barton and Johnny Smith, Mossman and Jinsei Shinzaki vs Steve Williams and Sedman, and Sabu vs Shigeo Okamura as the top matches. The only match where Kawada and Tenryu will be on opposite sides that was announced is August 25th in Nagaoka with Kawada and Mossman and Yoshiaki Fujiwara vs Hansen and Tenryu and Shinzaki. No matches were announced for the big show on the tour, which is September 2nd at Budokan Hall. Pro Wrestling Noah. The debut show on August 5th will officially be a February 3rd fall match with Kenta Kobashi and Jun Akiyama vs Mitsuharu Misawa and Akira Tao. Kobashi was even back publicly training with Yoshinobu Kanemaru in the ring, doing all his spots for the press this past week, although the reality is he's got no business out there. That's why it's safe to say that as great as Kobashi is, and except for and maybe even including Flair, he's the most consistent great performer of the era, but when he's 40, it's doubtful he'll be having the matches Ric Flair had when he was 40. Mitsuharu Misawa said that promotions in both Korea and Taiwan want to do talent exchanges with his group. July 19th TV show drew a 3.1 rating. The July 26th show was actually headlined by the Pancrase match from July 23rd as the TV main event with Yuki Kondo beating Dan Theodore. The show is showing actually a tremendous ratings increase since it started being a wrestling and martial arts news show as opposed to the old All Japan format. New Japan. From the July 14th TV show, the top two matches were the Kashin and Liger vs Sasuke and Hamada tag and a six-man. As mentioned last week, the Liger match was well below par. Sasuke still did his trademark moves, including an unbelievable looking dive over the top, but inside the ring his selling looked bad. Even Liger and Hamada seemed to have problems on some spots. The worst was Sasuke was supposed to hit Hamada on a drop kick off the top and totally missed the move, but Hamada sold anyway, 1 3/4 stars. Main was Goto and Chono and Tenzan over Nakanishi and Yoshi and Sasaki, which was terrible. After Tenzan pinned Sasaki, they did an angle after where Kojima came out with a wrench to attack the faces and Yoshi just walked off and let Sasaki and Nakanishi take it. Nagata made the save, but didn't fare very well in a real bad-looking no-sell brawl. Fujinami invited Hashimoto to join the G1 tournament, saying that he would give up his slot in the tournament to Hashimoto if he'd agree to it. The company also said they were inviting Kawada and Masafuchi from All Japan to attend the August 11th Tokyo Sumo Hall show, while on August 1st, Tenryu talked about possibly wrestling New Japan's Shiro Koshinaka. The two were partners in the old Heisei Ishgun group in New Japan years back, on an All Japan card, so they seem to be building to some sort of inter-promotional stuff. Former K1 star Masaki Sadake showed up at a press conference on July 28th with Inoki, Kazuyuki Fujita and Tokumitsu Ishizawa talking about the Pride August 27th Seibu Dome show, and Sadake issued a challenge to both Tadao Yasuda and Shinya Hashimoto for DSC. July 15th TV drew a 2.3 rating. Other Japan notes. FMW ran a major show before a packed house of 2,150 on July 28 at Korakuen Hall, featuring the return of Masato Tanaka, who teamed with Hisakatsu Oya and the original Hayabusa to beat Jinsei Shinzaki and Mr. Ganasuke and Koto Fuyuki when Shinzaki turned on Ganasuke, allowing Hayabusa to pin Ganasuke with the Firebird 450 splash. Both the group's tag titles changed hands earlier in the show as Hideki Hasaka and Yoshinori Sasaki won the Woo Hardcore tag titles from Samoans Matty Smalls and Eddie Fatu, while Noah wrestlers Yoshinobu Kanemaru and Masao Inoue took their second straight win, this time getting the Woo tag titles, beating Gedo and Jado in 1915. The only title that didn't change hands saw Kentaro Kanemura retain the singles hardcore title, pinning Mike Samples. Tiger Mask retained the British Junior title on the Michinoku show on July 27th in Sapporo over the AAA version of Psychosis. Michinoku had what was considered a successful two-day swing in Sapporo, drawing just over 1,000 each night. FMW's next major show will be September 21st at the Sapporo Green Dome. LLPW on August 19th in Soka will be promoting a mixed tag with Shinobu Kondori teaming with the original Tiger Mask, Satoru Sayama, to face the current Tiger Mask and Rumi Kazama. CMLL opened its latest Mil Mascaras tour on July 29th with Starman, Ligwala, Enigma, Fugaz, Tigre Blanco, Super Cacao, Tarzan Boy, Ricky Marvin, Archangel, Kimba, Virus, Fuerza Guerrera, Atlantis, and using Mascaras and Dos Caras as the lead faces and Pirata Morgan and Grand Marcus Jr. as the main event heels. Mascaras beat Morgan to keep the IWA title on July 31st in Osaka. Yoshiko Tamura scored her first career win over Kyoko Inoue on the Neo Ladies show on July 30th at Korakuen Hall to set up a Tamura vs Debbie Malenko, no actual relation to the Malenkos, who hasn't wrestled since breaking her leg 7 years ago. Match on August 24th in the United States to crown a new NWA Women's Champion. Here and there. The Superstars of Wrestling Tour of Australia opened on July 28 and featured more fun with Dennis Rodman. Rodman was flown to Australia a week ahead to do publicity, but then partied so much his first night in that he missed all his scheduled media appearances. On July 28, he no-showed the autograph session at the show, but did do somewhat of his planned run-in to set up his July 30th match against Curt Hennig. The planned finish of the Hennig vs. Brutus Beefcake match to determine the first world champion was for Rodman to come out midway through the match and attack Hennig, leading to a pull-apart to build up the match after Hennig would later win. Rodman, as it turned out, arrived late, but at least he came in time to run out after the match was over. Both Greg Valentine and John Tenta, as Earthquake, cancelled the tour. They made Tatanka the Australian champion over one-man gang and Road Warriors the tag champs over Public Enemy in a tables match. Reports were that Typhoon, Fred Ottman, and gang had dropped a lot of weight, and that Hawk showed up badly out of shape. July 29th in Brisbane drew 4,000 fans, which saw Hennig beat Rodman via DQ in a match described as very solid, with Rodman doing a good job before P interfered for the DQ, and P beat Warriors to win the tag titles. The biggest show of the tour was July 30th in Sydney, billed as a worldwide pay-per-view show and drew an estimated 10,000 fans, although no word on paid versus paper. Hennig and Rodman actually had the best match of the show in Sydney, ending with what was described as a lame finish when both punched the ref after 5 minutes. Hennig played heel, but the fans booed the hell out of Rodman and the guys did a double turn. Hennig juiced early and welted up Rodman's chest with hard chops. Rodman wasn't horrible, although the reports said that was largely due to Hennig. Joe Buhner, a well-known boxer from the 70s who twice went the distance against Muhammad Ali, was scheduled as ref, but instead ended up as the second for Sweet Destiny in a women's match. Buhner's spot was Typhoon do a run-in, get hit with one punch, and Typhoon fled the scene. Beefcake changed his name on the tour to Bruce Force, probably because they are attempting to air this in many places on pay-per-view and WWF owns the rights to the Brutus Beefcake name. Warriors regained the title from Public Enemy in the worst match on the show, as Hawk and Grunge in particular looked out of shape and horrible. This tour goes until August 13th and they are planning a second tour for next March. The first 2 FMW videotape releases for the American market come out on August 29th with both VHS and DVD versions. The first tape, called Legend Dawns, includes 3 matches: Hayabusa and Katsutoshi Niyama vs. Hiskatsu Oya and the Gladiator, Mike Awesome, Mitsuhiro Matsunaga vs. Mr. Pogo in a barbed wire match, and Megumi Kudo vs. Shark Tsuchiya in what is being billed as a chick fight. The second tape will be called King of the Death Matches, with a barbed wire match with Cactus Jack vs. Yukihiro Kanemura, a death match with Gladiator and Horace Boulder, Horace Hogan, and Oya vs. Super Leather and Headhunters, and an electrified barbed wire match with Hayabusa and Masato Tanaka vs. Terry Funk and Pogo. The proposed September 8th Stampede/WWF show at the Corral in Calgary won't be promoted as a benefit show for Brian Pillman, but they may honor Stampede legends during the show, one of which would be Pillman, at the NFL Hall of Fame ceremonies held July 29th in Canton, Ohio. Dave Wilcox, formerly of the San Francisco 49ers, was inducted. He mentioned his son Josh, who has worked in the past for ECW, as an aspiring wrestler with the WWF. Fox Sports Net ran a feature on really hardcore backyard wrestling and then followed with a poll question: is wrestling poisoning today's youth in the US? The results were 52% no and 48% yes. They also ran a 30-minute news feature on the trend, which included clips from Bret Hart saying that most of the kids who participate in it would probably never even see the inside of a pro wrestling ring. The feature was based around Andre Verdun, a well-spoken Southern California teenager who has gained quite a bit of notoriety scarring himself up and giving himself concussions on video. The stuff makes for some great video footage for people to be shocked by, with plenty of talk about potential for injuries, brain damage, and even death. One doctor quoted said a lot of the damage being done won't show up on these kids until later in life, and they did have an interview with a 30-year-old whose body is shot doing a tamer form of backyard wrestling a decade ago. Still, the problem isn't kids fooling around doing backyard wrestling, which has turned into a negative term for something that sometimes is, but isn't necessarily always, something negative. The problem is not backyard wrestling, but stupid backyard wrestling. The usage of barbed wire and light bulbs can be dangerous, particularly if there is an accident with the eyes. Most of the time it usually just leads to cuts and abrasions, which aren't permanent injuries, although the scarring can be visually permanent. The real stupid stuff like the roof dives or the unprotected all-out chair shots to the head are the real dangers. Other than that, for better or worse, most of the fooling around and rolling around aspects of kids imitating pro wrestling moves and faking them badly on each other is probably less dangerous than kids playing tackle football in the streets for real as they did years ago. Latest TV ratings from Puerto Rico. July 15 saw WWC do a 9.9 rating and 37 share, IWA drew a 6.9 rating and 27, WWF drew a 7.0 and 21. For July 16, WWC drew a 12.2 and 41 and IWA drew a 6.9 and 27. July 22 saw WWC at 9.8 and 42, IWA at 6.3 and 24, and July 23 saw WWC at 11.8 and 37 and IWA at 3.3 and 10. WWC is still headlining with the Carly Colon vs. Ray Gonzalez program, and wrestlers haven't been paid since July 16, so there is a lot of bad morale due to that. Carlos Colon left after the Aniversario shows for a vacation in Canada visiting his in-laws but returned over the weekend. Luis Davila, who played the role as head of the championship committee in WWC, jumped to IWA where he debuted on July 22 in the same type of role. IWA's next major show will be September 30 at the Coliseum in Carolina using WWF talent, apparently bringing in two of the top names for a main event. Brett Sanders is working for IWA under the name Vizag. Update on the fundraising in the Pillman show from a few months back. Nash never did send the promised check for $20,000. Neither did Arquette, who said he'd split his WCW check for TV and pay-per-view 3 ways between the Pillman family, Darren Drozdov, and the Brian Hildebrand family, although he's been in contact and is still waiting to get paid for the pay-per-view by WCW. The latest Whatever Happened to newsletter listed 2 deaths we hadn't reported on: Joe Scarpello, a former NCAA champion in 1947 and 1950 who was mainly a prelim wrestler in the AWA for 2 decades, passed away last November from complications from Alzheimer's. And Mr. Ebony, former Mid-South wrestler Tom Jones, who wrestled in the 70s and 80s mainly in the southern states and Texas, who gained his greatest fame as a journeyman on the old world-class TV show, passed away in December at the age of 46 from a heart attack. In a very weird item related to something in last week's Observer, PPI Entertainment, which is syndicating the Urban Wrestling Federation, claims the shows at the Grand Olympic Auditorium are not television tapings for their syndication even though they are using all the same wrestlers. They are saying it is a show unrelated to them. As expected, after losing the Loser Leaves Town match, Bob Armstrong returned to Knoxville on July 21 under a mask as the Georgia Jawjacker. Armstrong spanked Sin, who did appear at the show. Jim Cornette was not there due to the legal issues. When the assassin attacked him to set up a match where the loser would have to unmask and leave town, and all the OVW wrestlers would be banned from the building. They tried to put over that the assassin was the famous one, Jody Hamilton, that Armstrong probably wrestled 1,000,000 times since the late 60s, but it wasn't. Sin did a promo earlier in the card regarding the incident, claiming that Terry Landell maced her 4 times. There was extra police security at the Landell show, which was a free show down the street in the parking lot of a muffler shop, as well as a reporter from the local paper covering Landell's show. Fuller announced besides Jawjacker vs. Assassin, they would have a 12-man tournament to create a USA heavyweight champion. That was the singles belt used in the 80s when Fuller ran the territory as USA Pro Wrestling, and that Terry Gordy and Bill Dundee would be brought in. At this point, Ron Fuller is only planning on running 5 more Friday night shows before closing up shop. Add John Tenta to the list of those opening up wrestling schools. The Discovery Channel is doing a Shark Week from August 13th to August 20th. I have no idea how this will fit in, but wrestler Shark Boy Dean Roll appears between 9 and 10 p.m. on August 13th and again 1 week later. Bill Dundee returned to Power Pro Wrestling in Memphis, like will always happen eventually, on July 22nd. Doug Gilbert returned to NWA Worldwide at the July 29th TV tapings in Nashville, which consisted of mainly WCW Power Plant wrestlers including Danny Fackwar, Dan Devine in New Japan, Kiwi Chris Harris, Troy Andrews, Elix Skipper and Mike Sanders, and Japanese indie wrestler Yuji Kito. Gong Magazine's Special Pro Wrestling American magazine, which has a history of American pro wrestling dating back to 1769, also has a feature on this publication. Also want to make recognition for the great work Mohammed Chatra of England did in his tenure as our distributor over the past few years. A show on July 29th in Shelby, North Carolina drew 500 fans promoted by Dexter Holly, off advertising the Hardys, Jimmy Valiant and Rock and Roll Express, none of whom were booked or appeared, which naturally left the paying audience livid. Thanks to Michael Monaveyada.com for putting together the July 31st tribute show to Gordon Solie, literally at the last minute, which featured Dory Funk, Ted DiBiase, Ric Flair, Jack Briscoe, Billy Graham, Brian Blair, Steve Kieran, former wrestling writer Steve Beverly, and Howard Brody. I want to make a special thanks to Flair, who literally did the show with zero notice, and Briscoe, who is recovering from surgery and was only supposed to stay on for a few minutes and ended up staying for more than an hour. The show will be replayed on August 23rd. On the Game Show Network on July 30th was a repeat of a 1962 episode of To Tell the Truth, which featured Paul Bosch as the character, and he fooled 3 of the 4 panelists. The irony is that on the remake of the show that was filmed in the last week or two, Leigh Thatcher appeared. Can-Am Wrestling Federation on July 27th drew 0 paid in Sherwood Park, AB. The crew came to the building, saw no fans there, and had to drive back to Calgary. The next night they worked Edmonton with just 17 paid. MMA. There is a lot of controversy regarding the booking of Ryan Gracie for the match with Tokumitsu Ishizawa, Kendo Kashin, on August 27th at the Seibu Dome, as it violated one of Japan's unwritten rules regarding participation in martial arts sports. While not everyone involved has to be a great sportsman, there is an unwritten rule that anyone who commits a violent act with an instrument like a gun or knife should never be allowed to compete in a fighting sport event, and booking Gracie, who allegedly pulled out a knife in a bar fight in Brazil a few months ago, violates that. K1 ran a mini Grand Prix tournament on July 30th at the Nagoya Rainbow Hall before a sellout 10,000 fans. The show drew a 14.5 rating later that evening on the Fuji network, which is very good, but far from the record-level numbers the previous show did. It was basically Ernesto Hoost and Jerome LeBanner as the standouts, with 6 other fighters of various skill levels designed not to threaten the 2 big stars getting into the final match. They made it to the finals, which guaranteed each a spot in the final 8 in December at the Tokyo Dome. But the match was disappointing as there were just a few punches and kicks thrown. At the end of the round, Hoost complained about his right knee hurting and his corner threw in the towel, figuring continuing would risk aggravating the injury and threaten his ability to recover by December. They also brought in Mike Bernardo, the current WBC World Heavyweight Boxing Champion. If you recall how that happened, you'd realize just how unprestigious this title really is. Defending his title, and he went to a fast no contest with Justin Fortune when there was an accidental headbutt and Fortune was bleeding badly and the bout had to be stopped in about 30 seconds. Sam Greco pulled out of the tournament just a day or 2 before also citing an injury, so the show and tournament were considered disappointments. At the Mundial 2000, which is the World Championships of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu held over the weekend, Jean Mesquita, from northeastern Brazil, passed away in the brown belt competition from a heart attack. There have been reports, unconfirmed, of him taking a performance-enhancing substance just before the fight. Mesquita and his opponent were locking up and he just collapsed. The doctors tried to revive him, and did once, before he died a few hours later in the hospital. The proposed Strike Force show for later this year at the San Jose Arena is now being planned for around February of 2001. They are trying to put together a show for pay-per-view and have been given the indication that a combination of sanctioning by the California State Athletic Commission and a super marquee main event could get them not only on the satellite network, but in demand would put them on basic cable. Unfortunately, the match they are hoping for to fit that category is Royce Gracie versus Frank Shamrock, and I wouldn't hold my breath waiting for that one to happen. Semi Schilt defends the King of Pancrase title against Asami Shibuya to headline the September 24th show at Yokohama Bunka Gym. ECW. Viewers' Choice Canada is considering no longer airing ECW pay-per-views unless the company gets back on television in Canada, pending a decision shortly. Even the Anarchy Rules show on October 1st is in danger of not airing. Still nothing new officially on the TV situation, and they've basically got 8 shows left on TNN. At press time, negotiations to close a deal were stronger than they had been in the past, more likely for a non-prime time slot but on a strong network. A lot still depends on the compensation, because the production has to be moved up a level and funds have to be pumped in from television, or a media conglomerate has to buy in and help fund it and carry early losses for the company to be able to make it financially. The debuts in Dallas and Houston drew hot crowds in excess of 2,000 in both cities. Originally the TV was to be taped in Dallas, but a canceled plane flight kept production from being able to tape Dallas, so they did it the next night. Balls Mahoney was again not flown in, nor was Dawn Marie, but they can do whatever they need to do with her in studio since she has no role in front of the public yet. They did an angle at TV where the FBI was attacking Mikey Whipwreck, and Yoshihiro Tajiri made the save to apparently plug him into a tag team program. This also seems to indicate Super Crazy not being around for a while. Crazy is still on payroll, although it's been months now since he's been available after being deported. They did a three-way with Lynn, Corino and Tajiri, which saw Anton cost Lynn the match and Corino went over. Dreamer saved Lynn afterwards and set up a singles match with Anton that Dreamer won, bleeding a lot in the process. Main was Van Dam over Cash, which I'm told could be edited into a fantastic match because there was a lot of new moves never done before, but it was also said to be very sloppy with missed spots as well. They also seemed to be trying to use Sandman to get Chili Willy over as a major babyface. Cyrus claimed he had a one-night wrestling license and said he wanted a match with Gertner. Spike Dudley came out and said that he was given control of the booking for the show by Heyman and was ordering Cyrus to instead wrestle Sandman. Cyrus tried to talk Sandman out of it, but Sandman started caning him until Rhino showed up and once again pile-drove Spike through a table. Willie ended up saving Sandman. At the house show the previous night they used Spike in the old New Jack role of someone running in to save after a Baldy's beating of Christian York and Joey Matthews. The Dallas main event of Van Dam vs. Corino was somewhat ruined because fans were more into chanting for a woman at ringside to take off her top. Whether it's the clash of titans in the ring or the drama that unfolds outside it, we're here to break it down, match by match, feud by feud. Remember, in the world of wrestling, every day is a battle, and every victory is a story waiting to be told. Until next time, keep the passion alive, and never stop wrestling with the possibilities. This is the Pro Wrestle Machine. WCW. Nitro on July 31st from Cincinnati was just a show, having largely abandoned much of the formula that made the shows a few weeks ago so well received. Booker T came out with his wife and announced the main event with Sting, which got only a lukewarm reaction. Jarrett came out. TX kicked Jarrett, but injured his legit bad knee in the process. Jarrett got the advantage with a chair shot and a figure 4 in the ropes before Sting made the save, unmasked, with no visible burns and no mention at all of the previous angle, and challenged Vampiro, which I guess acknowledged the angle but nobody talked about it much. Jarrett hit Booker's wife Lavastia in the front row with a guitar and she did a stretcher job. Vito beat Bagwell with the ultra-annoying Judy Bagwell doing commentary, with new makeup and a new hairdo. Bagwell threw some of the worst clotheslines you'll ever see. If you surmise that this result is because Bagwell is in the doghouse, you probably surmised correctly. These were almost Dusty stationary clothesline caliber. Kiwi, formerly Kiwi, beat Artist in a really bad match. I guess the gimmick is he's tough in the ring and a total sissy outside of it, at least as best I can tell. Storm won the WCW version of the Triple Crown, taking the Cruiserweight belt from Lieutenant Loco with a half crab. One of the announcers, I think it was Tony Schiavone, asked if anyone had ever held 3 belts at once. How about Ultimo Dragon, who held 10, although said to be 9? Something talked about how many times on Nitro not all that many years ago. Storm renamed the Hardcore belt the Saskatchewan Hardcore International title, SHIT, saying the initials are what he thought of hardcore wrestling. To show how tough someone holds 3 belts truly is, Nash came on, and without anything resembling a struggle, beat Storm up like he was every other Cruiserweight champion in history. Nash then did a very disappointing supposed shoot interview, talking about when he was a bouncer, he kicked NFL players out of clubs before. Great, you and your buddies ganged up on drunk football players. He then talked about the one time he wasn't professional in the ring, a story about Pierre Ouellette who WCW is considering bringing in. It was a totally true story, although it was lost on literally all but about 10 people in the world. When Nash was WWF champ, Ouellette refused to do a job in Montreal because it was his hometown and it was a real big deal at the time and Ouellette got in the major doghouse over it. The next night in Quebec City, Nash put a hurting on him and pinned him clean. Problem is, nobody knows the story, and to the people at home listening, they probably thought Nash had a few too many and in his dreams thought he was Shawn Michaels because that's what a guy refusing to do a job in his hometown of Montreal connotate to 99.9% of the people who think they know. But even they know Nash never beat up Bret Hart in the ring the next night, so they probably thought the whole thing was a delusion. He brought up Hall once again, which proves there is at least some form of working doing, since he said he'll never rest until Hall is brought back. Steiner came out to set up their match for later. Sting beat Jarrett clean and they pretended Jarrett was injured and taken to the hospital. In a terrible 3-way, Chronic retained the title with a totally mistimed finish. Adams hit Muta with a chair and then O'Hare was supposed to do the Swanton bomb. Jeff Hardy Swanton but using O'Hare's first name. Immediately on Vampiro, But it took ridiculously long to get the spot done, and Muta had to sell the chair forever for the double pin, and then they raised Kronik's hand. Muta sprayed mist on both guys after. Vampiro and Muta were called the Brothers in Paint, which was taken from a 1988 reference when Sting and Road Warriors worked six-man tags together. Douglas beat Kidman in a Viagra on a pole match. This was stupid except for Madden's commentary talking about famous Viagra on a pole matches in the past like Ganya Bockwinkel in Minneapolis and even one with Andre Wilson's extensions were really noticeable. Then came a really terrible women's food fight with Guns and Hancock. To make things worse, for the crowd Liv, David Flair and AWOL were having another terrible match in the ring. Finally the women came out all covered with food and Hancock got the pin after a body slam. Since Kidman lost, but swallowed some Viagra in the process, a bunch of Nitro girls wanted to leave with him. Scott Steiner beat Nash in a straight-jacket match when Rick interfered and Scott used a chair. It was terrible, including a chair shot from Midaja that even Joel Gertner would be embarrassed by. The idea was the guy in the straight-jacket would be helpless, and the winner could pound him until he got tired. Scott apparently got tired the minute he got the jacket on because they played the music and it was over. The idea of sort of hinting, or even outright saying, that wrestling is a work but this match is a shoot is a successful offshoot of so many historical feuds. Even in the 70s the idea that wrestling was worked but the title matches were real was prevalent, and the title matches were worked differently in general, which gave them their aura, and even Hashimoto Ogawa, which from a mainstream standpoint, 24.0 quarter, was the hottest thing anywhere this year, was based on exactly that. The reason it worked was partially due to shoot angles and shoot interviews so that can pay huge dividends, at least in Japan, but also for the first match, because the style of what they were doing looked completely different from what the people were used to, and they could take it, and by the reactions. Many did, or at least did as a suspension of disbelief, enough to make it last now going on 18 months as the hottest program in the country. Nash and Steiner, with the badly worked match, the Midaja chair shot, and the stupid straight jacket gimmick, looked almost like everything else on the show except worse than most, and totally destroyed any aura of it getting over as something other than just pro wrestling as usual. Finally T beat Sting clean with the Urinage 511 after Sting was juiced being attacked by Demon from under the ring. Sting pulled out Demon, but Vampiro and Muta and Jarrett all came out. Jarrett hit T with a chair and ended up hitting his knee with a guitar after tying him upside down with a rope. Sting was thrown into Demon's lair and Demon threw fire at it. Very creative booking. Amateur special effects and overall below average wrestling, and far too many angles to make any of them mean much. We don't have full details on the August 2nd Thunder. As a way to get heat, Storm is saying all cruiserweights have to weigh in at under 100 kilos. They did a Douglas vs. Bagwell match which saw Judy and Tori go at it. Russo did his shoot interview which we're told was a speech attempting to turn himself babyface, blaming all his problems on politics, saying WWF was doing 6.9 and 7.0 ratings on Raw when he left, actual average was 6.2, saying the minute Hogan returns, he's leaving. He said that Hogan had just served him with papers and kept insisting it was a shoot. Thunder on July 26th was a mess live, but on television the next day it was a basic decent show. They had a delay of 20 to 30 minutes live due to a bomb threat. The opener was Mysterio Jr. and Guerrero over Moore and Helms in a fast-paced match. It wasn't any building, just a lot of high spots sped through, ending with Guerrero doing a hot 450 on Moore for the pin. The Tanda Tease was arm wrestling with Major Guns vs. Miss Hancock, ending when ref David Flair helped Hancock and Wall joined MIA as Sergeant AWOL. When he made the save, he was already wearing fatigues. Then he got asked to join. He must have been walking around all day thinking this is my chance to impress those guys, so I'll dress like them and they'll ask me to join. Skip Along, Elix Skipper, made his debut. Unfortunately, for all the good impressions he's made, he looked nervous, tentative and green and missing so many spots including his finisher. I Am Smooth, which is Harold Hogue's ring name, is the fighting limo driver. Hey, they used to have fighting truck drivers, so why not? Squashed all three members of the Young Dragons. Muta and Vampiro beat O'Hare and Jindrak. O'Hare and Jindrak looked pretty green. After the match, Demon attacked the losers until Kronik made the save. The latest Judy Bagwell travesty saw her have a match with Kanyon. Kanyon threatened to break her neck unless Buff agreed to a match on pay-per-view where Judy would become Kanyon's slave for 30 days. At least Kanyon didn't ask for her to become his mom or his sex slave, although the idea of Judy Bagwell dressed like Kimberly isn't a pleasant thought. Kanyon gave her a diamond cutter, but luckily we didn't see it on camera again. I don't know if it's because she sells diamond cutters so bad or simply a matter of taste. And speaking of that, the next thing we learned is that Shane Douglas can't get it up. He blamed it on the political pressure. At least Tori didn't suggest maybe he should get off the gas for a while. It makes Douglas look really bad not only doing this angle, but doing it with Tori Wilson. It looked like they may be setting the stage where this whole deal is a ruse that Wilson and Kidman are playing on Douglas, being that the excuse was she snuck into her apartment since he still has a key and has been stealing the tapes. Storm beat Vito clean with a half crab. Storm asked for a match where no objects are used, but then Storm himself used a chair. Then came the Goldberg shoot interview. I guess leading to more Nash and Russo shoot interviews. Russo said he was taking himself off TV after July 9th. That's lasting all of 3 weeks. It was probably the best interview Goldberg ever did. It's sad though because the people who played the charity card, particularly in wrestling, are more often than not the biggest frauds. But he's turning face. He credited himself with drawing money and talked about Hogan and Flair helping build the company and said Hall and Nash had nothing to do with the Georgia Dome drawing 42,000. Well, he can claim credit for that one. Hogan is the funniest, because the crowd really was drawn by the Goldberg short-lived phenomenon. Then Hogan, after the advance was record-setting and it was guaranteed to draw more than 35,000, suggested doing a non-title dark match with Goldberg so historically he could take credit for a house that was really drawn by two things, Goldberg and Nitro. Then, when it became a deal where the ratings raced to was tooth and nail, it was switched to a title match as the main event. Technically Goldberg did beat Hall on that show, so Hall putting over Goldberg added to the drama of the event, although meant nothing as far as drawing the house. A lot of people are critical of these interviews because they expose the product as a work while trying to get this one angle over as a shoot, which nobody is going to believe anyway. The one thing about it is, pro wrestling to an extent has always been sold that way. In the 70s, deep down most fans knew wrestling was worked, but they tried, and granted not in this detailed a fashion, to sell the idea that the title matches were real and it was the title matches that drew the big houses. New Japan practically built a company around that same idea, although in neither case was there an outright admission the regular product was a work on their TV shows, but in the magazines there was always that reading between the lines stuff. It's just a modernized version. Now, the big difference comes with the execution. In those instances, whether it be New Japan or NWA World title matches of the 70s, the matches themselves had to follow up the perception created in the interviews and the work itself in the ring was of a different style. Luckily Goldberg's only style is that short powerful stuff that people buy, and Steiner can pull it off as well, but if Nash goes in there clowning, it'll kill the effect. TV Main was a lights-out match with Jarrett over Booker T when Jarrett hit his knee with a chair and put him in the figure 4 with T hanging outside the ring. He sold great the idea of not submitting and then passed out from the pain and the ref stopped the match. Okay, this is non-sanctioned and it was a stretch enough explaining there was a ref to count the falls, but if WCW was washing its hands, why would the ref stop the match? I guess it really doesn't matter because they were trying to do Austin Hart. Ric Flair is scheduled for an October return most likely. He's excited because that'll be the first time in more than a year that he'll be able to train his chest and shoulders hard, he wasn't able to due to the shoulder injury, and get back as much of his physique as someone just a few months before his 52nd birthday can, not to mention he'll have the ability to throw the chops and punches without so much pain in the ring. From what we gathered, Brad Siegel didn't want him back in the ring, but Russo does. Speaking of Flair, add him to the list of wrestlers currently working on their autobiography through the William Morris Agency. Bret Hart has also been spending his time away from the ring working on a similar autobiographical project. Hart wrote in his Calgary Sun column about the disproportionately high number of wrestlers that have died in recent years, talking about the travel demands, which are probably the hardest part of wrestling now but are much easier than they were in the 80s when the top wrestlers really did wrestle as many as 350 matches in a year. He wrote about Davey Boy Smith's pain pill addiction in a very sympathetic light and said, quite frankly, Davey's situation scares me. Piper was officially released. On an unrelated note, Piper was very upset when he brought up unionization on the Larry King show that aired prior to the premiere of Beyond the Mat, and the response of Mick Foley kind of blowing the subject off. Hulk Hogan did as well, although I guess he must have expected that Kathy Dingman, who was supposed to play the role of Papaya, formerly BB in WWF, is already done. WCW sources claim that her fiancé, Bob Howard, Hardcore Holly, didn't want her taking the job. Nora Greenwald, Mona, was also released. Bobby Heenan has been taken off the road and his sole duties in WCW will be doing in-studio voiceovers for Worldwide and such. Bill Goldberg suffered a shoulder separation in the second Booker T match on July 24, delivering a hard spear, but it was popped back in. There was even more skepticism than usual of this one, since Goldberg's dressing room rep is so bad because he doesn't fully understand the business, but understands enough the part about a lot of the wrestlers on top being jealous of him and that management makes a lot of mistakes based on those wrestlers' suggestions to where he's overly cautious about his own career to the point he doesn't want to lose or sell much. Booker T's knee is a lot worse than is being let on, stemming from the spot where he leapfrogged a Goldberg spear, but Goldberg still clipped him running through a few weeks ago. The first of the two matches on July 24th was totally botched up. Goldberg was supposed to dominate, but the match was supposed to go considerably longer, as the segment was booked for 10 minutes to 11 minutes, which would indicate 8 to 9 in the ring, and it went 2:41. The finish was supposed to be a lot more dramatic, with the ref continually asking Booker if he'd submit, but he'd keep refusing, until finally Stevie Ray would throw the towel. Nash missed TV last week because he was filming an episode of the new WB show about the woman who marries a pro wrestler. There is a lot of skepticism regarding the Goldberg injury, even more openly than usual. He was scheduled for a much-hyped appearance at the Nitro Grill on July 28, and Lance Storm and Mike Awesome were given the last-minute word to take his place. Evan Courageous' injury was diagnosed as a dislocated ankle, and he'll probably be out past the pay-per-view. There were Turner accountants at TV last week trying to find ways to cut costs. Matt Williams, who is the director of research at WCW, is the latest to leave for another job in the Turner organization. Williams just finished a study of wrestling fans, which apparently showed that went against much of the conventional wisdom within the organization of what people tune in to wrestling for. The research showed that the reason fans aren't watching the show, and the main complaint among those who still are, is the lack of emphasis on the wrestling and too much time devoted to soap opera and non-wrestling related antics on television. As you can imagine, the results of the study buried him, because it in its own way concludes that the emphasis of those running things may be all wrong, and it makes the jobs of the wrestler's ability to perform more important than the creative end, which is something those in power don't want to hear. Bret Hart was the celebrity host at the Molson Indy Auto Race in Toronto, which drew 52,000 fans per day and also had in attendance Sylvester Stallone, Burt Reynolds, Paul Newman, and David Letterman. Hart also got some heat from the anti-handgun lobby in Alberta for taking a booking at a handgun shooting range in the West Edmonton Mall. There was some local press because Hart appeared with Ted Nugent, who espoused a pro-gun political viewpoint, and a media article linked the two of them together, while Hart, who never has espoused any political views on the issue, was there simply as an autograph signing. There is a 2-year-old horse racing at Monticello Raceway in New York on August 1st named Buff Bagwell. Regarding the situation with April Hunter, Egg, and the papaya roll, which went to Kathy Dingman, although she only lasted 2 weeks with it. Hunter's website is exactly the same now as it was when she formerly worked for WCW. What actually happened is that Terry Taylor offered Hunter the position after the pay-per-view, with a $500 per week base salary and $600 per appearance. She had an offer at the same time from Japan to train for wrestling under Jessica Soto, Bionic J of Urshan, as well as do a TV commercial for Toyota, and couldn't commit to WCW right away, so they hired Dingman to play the role of the busty redhead, so her not getting hired had nothing to do with website content but was more a timing issue. There are said to be 2 women, Hunter not being one of them, up for the role now. There was an inter-office memo that went around WCW on July 31st, which I guess shows just how respected Russo is these days internally. The memo was entitled Top 10 Questions Not Asked of Vince Russo. 10. Would you like to take this opportunity to claim credit for the return of Cake Day? 9. If the possum is going to wrestle for us, what reoccurring Saturday Night Live character will he be ripping off? 8. How much did SFX front you for decreasing the value of the organization? 7. Are you going to let Bill hyphenate his name to Banks Russo? 6. Can you funnel the unwanted talent to the marketing department? The new VP of marketing has numerous openings with lots of opportunity for advancement. 5. When is Hulk coming back? 4. What does the second W in WCW stand for? 3. How many young and hungry employees does it take to screw up an entire company? 2. WCW creative, is it a misnomer or simply a contradiction in terms? 1. Would you know an original idea if it jumped up and bit you on the ass, or would you just think it was the possum? Thunder tapings on July 25th in Wheeling, West Virginia drew 2,567, paying $54,980. July 29th in Moline, Illinois drew 1,704, paying $50,895. July 30th in Indianapolis drew 2,143, paid and $71,320. A house show heavily papered since the Conseco Fieldhouse holds more than 18,000. Nitro in Cincinnati drew 5,840 total, which was 3,566, paying $110,560. In Moline, no shows were Rey Mysterio Jr., Diamond Dallas Page, Bagwell, and Douglas, plus the newspaper ad had photos of Jarrett and Sting, who weren't on the lineup sheet in the building, but were advertised as being there and also weren't there. Luger subbed for Mysterio Jr. and did a job for Rection in 3:30 with the moonsault. Luger was said to have looked terrible, sucking air quickly. After Awesome beat Rick Steiner in a tables match, Steiner clotheslined a woman in the crowd plant that Awesome had brought out as his overweight valet. Nash beat Scott Steiner when Midaja went to hit Nash, who ducked, and hit Scott with the weakest chair shot in history that Scott sold anyway. Rick Steiner ran in, but Luger and Nash cleaned house on the Steiners. Main event saw Booker T keep the title over Kat. To show how over that match was, fans were leaving in droves from the start of the match. They pulled out a lot of stops in Indianapolis for the small crowd, including bringing in Goldberg and Bobby Heenan, who grew up in Indianapolis and was used as a ring announcer for the Nash vs. Scott Steiner match. They did a four-way with Perfect Event, O'Hare and Jindrak, Ray and Juvie and MIA, with the winners to get a tag title match next, which strangely was won by Jindrak and O'Hare, the team the fans cared about the least. Chronic then beat him in a short match. Goldberg was cheered doing a promo, but I guess his Thunder interview wasn't a turn since he turned the crowd on him with the promo. In the Awesome vs. Rick Steiner match, despite their respective TV roles, the fans cheered Steiner, and Awesome was booed when picking out a heavy woman planned to be his valet for the match. To make even more sense, Steiner came back later doing a heel run-in to help Scott against Nash. Luger tanked it in a quick loss to Douglas. Tori Wilson wasn't there, but Douglas claimed she was in the back naked but told her not to come out because Indianapolis wasn't worthy of it. Sting did mic work in his masked getup, so the fans believed it was really him, and he got a good reaction in a short handicap win over Muta and Demon. Main saw T beat Jarrett with Kat as ref, when Kat hit Jarrett to lead to the pin. WWF. Preliminary estimates are that the fully loaded pay-per-view drew 415,000 buys, which is about a 1.04 buy rate and would be about a $5.34 million company gross. Any figure over 350,000 buys would have to be considered a success because they were putting so-called unproven drawing talent in the main slots, and also because Benoit was not hyped and portrayed as Rock's biggest challenge as much as simply a transition challenge before getting back to Triple H yet. This show actually appears to have drawn, and remember, there can be major discrepancies between the first announced estimates and the final numbers, which actually aren't for sure until 90 days after the fact, drew slightly more buys than Rock vs. Triple H drew, 400,000, for their 60-minute match at Judgment Day. It marks Rock's 8th pay-per-view main event that topped the 1.0 mark, putting him, at the supposed age of 28, in 5th place on the all-time records behind only Hogan, Flair, Austin, and Hart. Officially, the Backlash pay-per-view on April 30th drew right at 700,000 buys, which would be one of the largest of all time and the biggest so-called non-major card. The fact that Backlash greatly outdrew King of the Ring and that Fully Loaded did about the same, shows that the idea of major and non-major events, at least outside of Royal Rumble, WrestleMania, and SummerSlam, is no longer an issue when it comes to getting people to buy, as they buy based on the card, not the name of the show, with those noted exceptions. Raw at the Georgia Dome was clearly designed to continue the big push for both Lita and Stratus, as they gave them the rubs teaming with Rock and Triple H, and as the ratings showed, it was a huge success. As nearly everyone has figured out, Lita really has something, but it's just a question of how to actually use it, because long singles matches with her will hurt her just as they did with Chyna, and she can't be pushed the same way as Sable because it's a totally different appeal. Sable was to horny guys. Lita has more of a tomboy appeal, but her biggest fan base will be teenage girls like the Crush gals from the 80s. X-Pac and Dog beat Snow and Blackman in a hardcore bout. Stephanie and Triple H did their soap opera. I swear that's the most realistic part of any wrestling show, because every guy can relate to a girlfriend who blows a gasket and refuses to watch the tape in its proper context. Love the line by Triple H, "I would never lie to you," coming from someone in pro wrestling. Finally they kissed and Foley came out with fake buckets of tears and basically ripped on the segment, saying it was boring. Hardys beat Edge and Christian by a DQ for a chair shot. Weak finish to their typical good match. They did a front and back chair shot on Jeff after the match, and a post-match angle where Matt went after them, but they doubled on him and left him laying. Hey, would mind another Inc. vs. Hardys at SummerSlam? Angle and Benoit beat Dudley's in a damn good match. They gave Benoit the 3D, but Show came out and choke slammed Bubba and put Benoit on top. For a guy who was just in the pay-per-view main event and seemed to improve his standing with a great match and a surprisingly strong buy rate, Benoit has seemed really toned down over the past week. Acolytes beat right to censor Buchanan and Goodfather, in a match that by all rights proved that Richards was right all along because this needed to have been censored, they were so bad. Rikishi beat Taz clean with a Samoan drop. Taz looked so small next to the 420-pound man. Guerrero and China beat Saturn and Venus when Guerrero pinned Saturn. Guerrero looked real good. China looked bad. Show vs. Kane never got started as Angle, Benoit and Shane all attacked Kane and Dudley's save. Even though it'll probably be a real good match, I'd hate for Benoit to be used with the Dudleys over the next month. Rock and Lita over Triple H and Stratus was about what you'd expect. The guys were good and the women were passable and the crowd was very into Lita, who scored the pin with a moonsault. Show ended with Rock hitting Triple H with a chair, and he fell KO'd onto Stratus in a 69 position. The PTC is now going to start monitoring Raw, Nitro and ECW on cable for potential advertiser boycotts. If they are successful, WCW will back down immediately because the higher-ups won't be able to justify if any more major sponsors back out over content, particularly without a business turnaround to justify the position it needs to be the way it is. ECW can't afford to back down but will be put in a bad position if it cuts into ad revenue. The Steven Richards character will either be very entertaining and a great heat-getting undercard device for the WWF if advertisers stick with Raw, or be viewed in hindsight as one of the dumbest gimmicks as far as timing is concerned in history, if they don't. Both The Undertaker and Jericho TV injury angles were shot because both were to miss television because of their honeymoons. Undertaker was married on July 21st and took his honeymoon after doing the angle on Raw. Jericho was married on July 30th in Winnipeg and left immediately on his honeymoon to Jamaica, having done his injury angle on July 25th. Jericho's wedding was put as a nearly full-page photo on the cover of the Winnipeg Sun the next day, with a full-page two-story noting that Manitoba's sexiest man, as Jericho was voted in a recent newspaper poll, had married Jessica Lockhart, his girlfriend of 2 years, noting in attendance were Don Callis, Billy Kidman, Lance Storm, Edge, Christian, and Disco Inferno. Their wedding moved the story of the Brad Pitt/Jennifer Aniston wedding to page 14 of the same paper. Jericho is also shooting a Chef Boyardee commercial in the Bahamas over the next month. Rock appears on Jay Leno on August 23rd to promote the pay-per-view. Some notes from the August 1st SmackDown tapings in Birmingham. They appear to be setting up a Venus vs. Guerrero IC title program since Eddie pinned Venus with a frog splash. First time he's done that move since his elbow injury, in a tag match with Rikishi and Taz as the respective partners. More setups for Edge and Christian vs. Hardys with Matt vs. Edge ending with a cheap chair DQ. Jeff slipped off the top of a ladder and landed stomach first on the ropes. Benoit and Show beat Kane and Rock when Shane interfered and Benoit pinned Rock after a diving headbutt. Now I'm really confused. They do this after their pay-per-view match. Main was Triple H and Angle and Stephanie over Dudley's and Lita when Triple H gave Lita a pedigree and Stephanie pinned her. Regarding the counts against Jim Cornette in regard to the incident with Terry Landell, it is believed that he simply won't be returning to Knoxville, at least until when / if the charges are dropped. Big Boss Man missed the weekend shows with a stomach virus. Austin is said to be training very hard in the company and he himself are termed cautiously optimistic he'll get the okay to at least return for limited duty later this year. It is said that his legs in particular are huge. Austin didn't attend the show in San Antonio on July 25th largely because he was in Los Angeles on other business that day. Billy Gunn has been cleared to return as of September 24th. Steve Regal is expected to start shortly after SummerSlam. They are also looking to start the Dupes on TV at some point in the near future. The XFL got its first embarrassment, and probably not its last, after talking about its employees having a higher moral standard than the NFL, and then the news came out that the man they chose to head their Chicago franchise, Ken Valdizieri, was accused of gambling on sporting events while he was employed by the Bears. The Philadelphia Daily News on July 25th ran an in-depth story on the XFL, noting the product is having problems attracting sponsors. OMD USA, an advertising firm who purchases for 87 companies including biggies like Visa, Pepsi, GM and Anheuser-Busch, noted advertisers are very cautious about this product. People are too scared, said managing partner Dan Rank. No one has seen it and no one knows what it's going to be. The little bit I've seen of it, it doesn't look like the WWF, it looks like the NFL. I think they are doing that so they don't care the NFL people. But what you buy might not be what you get. I don't think people will be willing to buy into it until they have seen it, and I think they'll be struggling until then. It's tough to sell it to our clients right now. The teams will each have 38 active players and 7 taxi squad members who will earn up to a $4,500 per game base salary and an additional $2,600 per player on the winning team. The eventual league champion will get another $22,222 bonus per player. The story also quoted sports super agent Lee Steinberg as predicting it will be a big success, saying a league needs players, empty markets and television, and the XFL will have all of those things come February. Dean Bonham of the Bonham Group, a sports marketing firm in Denver, said, "I don't think it will last long term. It will make a splash, but the splash is most likely to end up with the body dying and not coming up to swim." NBC is saying if it gets a 2 or 3 rating on Saturday night, that's good. But if there are not people in the stadium buying merchandise and concessions, paying for marketing and the traditional spending that goes on in stadiums, it won't work and the ratings will fail. I give the league 5 years before it finds itself in the graveyard with the other post-competitors of the NFL. At this point, the switch to TNN for Raw will be on September 25th. The final WWF show on USA, pending the results of the appeal, will be Sunday Night Heat on September 24th. SmackDown taped July 25th in San Antonio was overall the same formula show, but had a lot of strong wrestling, so I'd rate it pretty highly. They teased more problems with Stephanie McMahon and Triple H. This time Triple H bought her flowers and everything was great. Then Foley ordered a mixed tag with Stratus teaming with Triple H. Stratus came in and asked Triple H to show her some holds. He actually did a pretty good job as a guy pissed off having to show someone who has no business in the ring some moves. So in practicing a hammerlock escape, she was bending down and he was behind her when Stephanie walked in the room and threw a temper tantrum. The other major angle was after Jericho and Lita beat Benoit, replacing Triple H, who stormed out of the building after the Stephanie incident, and Stratus with Jericho pinning Benoit clean. Benoit attacked Jericho in a very violent-looking attack, including smashing a garage door down hard on his ribs, and Jericho did the bleeding from the mouth gimmick. Blackman pinned X-Pac in a surprisingly good hardcore title match with a lot of creative spots after a kendo stick to the head. So X-Pac and Dog are now both losers in trying to get their friendly rivalry singles careers going. Michael Cole at one point called X-Pac and Dog arguably the greatest tag team in the history of the WWF. Reports are that his nose is now larger than Triple H's. Geez, the team was always Dog and Billy Gunn. Foley did an interview largely just announcing the show. They showed Foley next to Rock backstage, and boy does Rock look so thin next to Foley. Hardy's beat Low Down, which is the name Brown and Chaz now having a good match, but afterwards Low Down left them laying. GMS losing via DQ to Taz was also good for what it was, with Scotty 2 Hotty doing a run-in and they laid Taz out with the dreaded worm. Kane and Dudley's beat Edge and Christian and Show in a tables match when Edge took a 3D through the tables. After the match, it appeared Kane was going to put Show through a table and then put Shane through a table, but they helped each other and Show choke slammed Kane through the tape. Saturn pinned Crash with an inside cradle. TV Main was Angle over Rock via DQ in 7:42. The action was fast-paced, work was great and heat was tremendous. Finish was the only weak part, as Benoit once again was there to get Rock over at the end of the show. Benoit tried to interfere but it did no good. Rock ended up hitting both Angle and Benoit with chair shots for the DQ after Rock had put Angle in a sharpshooter after a dragon screw. Seriously, he really did this, when Benoit interfered. Rock then after the match when he was leaving, was attacked by Benoit, which once again did no good as Rock laid him out again with a spinebuster on the ramp. Sergeant Slaughter wrestled and beat Sho Funaki on that same show during the Heat tapings. On the July 20th SmackDown show, indie workers including the Haas brothers, Billy Reel and Patty O'Brien appeared as extras on the show, I believe in the bar with Edge, Christian, and the Acolytes. Regarding the plight of the former radicals in WWF, most of the thoughts about any of them having second thoughts about making the move to WWF are created rumors. Although all liked wrestling, each to a different extent, dreaded going to work when they were in WCW because of all the backstage politics. Malenko is said to be not thrilled with his angle with wrestling women but is very happy where he's at. Saturn and Guerrero are wrestling through nagging injuries which take their physical and mental toll, but neither has requested any time off. Saturn has a nagging low back problem he's had for some time and is working through, and Guerrero's knee and back are in bad shape as he's never fully recovered from the lingering effects of the injuries when he was thrown from his car on New Year's Eve of 1999. There has been some talk of building to a Benoit vs. Triple H match at WrestleMania next year with Triple H as a babyface by that time, which would probably be based on the idea of Austin's ability to come back strong and headline the show against Rock. Of course, anything said about something more than 3 weeks out, let alone that many months away in this business, can't be construed as anything more than an idea thrown out that could be forgotten tomorrow. WWFE revealed in its annual report filed with the SEC that the World Fund of Nature has filed a copyright infringement suit in the English High Court seeking an injunction and unspecified damages, claiming a breach of contract dating back to a 1994 agreement the two sides signed. The suit claims the WWF violated the contract with use of the WWF logo in places it had agreed not to use it, as well as internet domain names like wwf.com and wwf.shopzone.com and usage of the term WWF in foreign broadcasts. The WWF contends its new logo, the Attitude logo, was created after 1994 and thus is independent of the agreement and thus not restricted by the 1994 agreement. The WWF in its prospectus did warn if the court rules against them, the suit may have a material adverse effect on its operations. The twins with The Godfather on Raw on July 24 were a different set of blonde twins than the ones mentioned. Diane and Elaine Klimaszewski are being geared for far more prominent roles. WWF The Music Volume 5 is scheduled for a release during the fourth quarter. Mark Kriegel of the New York Daily News on August 1 ran a column on Jim Ross' thoughts about Dennis Miller announcing Monday Night Football. Ratings for the week of July 23 in the UK saw Raw at 0.33, highest rated show on station, SmackDown at 0.22, fourth highest, Livewire and Superstars at 0.06, Nitro at 0.06, most watched on TNT Europe, Thunder at 0.04, second most. TNT's ratings should greatly increase in the UK when it goes digital. Thunder starts at 11 p.m. which kills its ratings with kids. The Fully Loaded show in Dallas on July 23 drew a sellout of 16,504, which was 14,668, paying $788,410 and another $157,048 in merchandise. $12 and SmackDown in San Antonio drew a sellout 7,856, paying $245,334. House show July 29 in Pittsburgh drew 9,668, paying $303,491. July 30 in Pensacola, Florida drew 7,814, paying $221,404. Raw from the Georgia Dome actually drew basically a packed house since there were 26,569 in the building, so the announced figure of 25,135 on television was actually low, and they set it up for a smaller configuration. The paid was $22,828 for $557,970. Arena merchandise from the period of July 24 through July 31 was $447,848 or $7.31 per head. Pittsburgh, which was not reported as that good of a show, was headlined by Rock and Kane and Rikishi over Triple H and Benoit and Angle when Rock pinned Benoit after the rock bottom. Triple H bladed early, which is a surprise for a house show match, and his arm was heavily padded, but he did work a fair amount of the match and took a people's elbow after the match. Pensacola saw Triple H, Angle and Rock off the show, so the main event was Rikishi over Taz plus Kane pinned Benoit. Foley, who lives in the area, did a promo at the show before it started saying he's glad to be in his hometown and said the last time he wrestled in Pensacola was in 1992 with a different promotion, meaning WCW. Fans booed, but Foley said they weren't booing loud enough, so they booed louder. He also said that everyone should support his good friend Al Snow by chanting Foley during his match, which of course they did. The readers' pages. Solie. I was saddened to hear about the death of Gordon Solie. Although I only began watching wrestling in earnest in 1995, Solie played a large part in the development of my love for the sport. When I first began viewing wrestling in 1995, I was lucky enough to discover a program on Eurosport, a small cable channel. This program featured episodes of New Japan TV with English commentary by Solie and Oliver Humperdinck. For me, the commentary was crucial and allowed me to gain an insight into the psychology of Japanese wrestling. When I first viewed the program, I found it bland and lacking a lot of the personality of the WWF. Wrestlers such as Tenzan bored me, and I found their matches somewhat pedestrian and lacking in excitement. I couldn't understand why the Japanese fans were cheering so enthusiastically, and it was only the prospect of seeing junior heavyweight matches that kept me watching. But as I watched, I started listening to Solie as he unflamboyantly relayed the storylines of the promotion and matches he was calling. As the weeks passed, I began to tune in more frequently and slowly began to understand psychology of matches. Solie explained clearly what the wrestlers were doing and why. Their moves and holds started to make sense. The faceless heavyweights started to become more important as Solie placed them into the wider context of the promotion. There was one match which Solie called which I can precisely link to my love of wrestling. It was an IWGP Junior Heavyweight title match with Shinjiro Otani. I think the other guy was Hiroshi Hashi. The wrestling in this match was technically excellent. It was better than anything I'd ever seen up until this point. But it was the manner in which the match was called which made it so fantastic. Solie took what this match had and added to it. What otherwise would have been a series of excellent moves began an enthralling story pitting the young no-hope challenger against the experienced superstar. As the match started, Solie discussed how Otani couldn't be expected to win because of his experience and young age. Solie saying that had credibility because we had learned by then when Solie said something, he usually was correct. Because he was almost always right. He had credibility which today's announcers are seriously lacking. As the match progressed, Otani was repeatedly beaten in exchanges, but at every pin attempt, kept kicking out at the last minute. Solie did a wonderful job of feigning surprise at these temporary escapes from the inevitable but still managed to maintain the belief in me that Otani was going to lose. But as the bout continued, Solie's excitement increased and with it so did my own. As Otani was hit with everything and kept kicking out, Solie got firmly behind him. In one match, Otani went from a novice who was going to lose to a wrestler who was a bona fide title contender. As Otani mounted one final comeback, delivering his best moves, only to have last-second kickouts with the referee's hand a fraction of an inch from the canvas, Solie portrayed the young wrestler's emotions better than any announcer I have ever seen since. The image of a tired Otani almost crying at now having achieved the pin while Solie reflected his frustration in commentary will live with me forever. Shortly afterwards, the program finished its run. By this point Solie had entrenched a love of Japanese wrestling within me and I continued to follow New Japan through tape trading. Unfortunately, I never had the opportunity to hear him call another match. I regret this greatly as during the New Japan shows, Solie often displayed moments of brilliance and called some matches better than any commentator I've heard since, even Jim Ross. At times he even managed to make Scott Norton's matches entertaining. And I can't think of any other commentator who could have done that. I'm sure Gordon Solie will be remembered by many people as one of the greatest announcers pro wrestling has ever seen. While I didn't have the opportunity to hear him during his prime years, I am pleased to say that I was briefly able to hear Solie calling some fantastic matches and providing great commentary. That experience was pivotal for me and I will remember Gordon Solie as the man most influential in building a love of this sport within me. Paul Jordan, England. Many thanks for including me on the Gordon Solie tribute show. I was both honored and flattered to be on with such elite company. For a 45-year-old game show journalist, I felt very much out of the loop with these gentlemen, but I enjoyed listening to the show as much as participating in it. The genuine honor was because of how much Gordon was part of my childhood, adolescence, college life and into adulthood. He genuinely was a part of my life and I felt I missed him when I didn't see him on Saturdays. Steve Beverly. PTC. Sorry, but I really don't see what is so sacrilegious about attacking the PTC. If Dr. Pepper pulled out of advertising because someone dared to make fun of those moral majority morons, shame on them. Funny how that hypocritical fool L. Brent Bozell says it's blacklisting to boycott Dr. Laura Schlesinger, yet leads a charge against the WWF. I'm utterly convinced the PTC and Mr. Bozo will peter out long before the WWF's popularity does. They have already taken such a publicity hit in their own right that the phony money-grubbing advertiser will run back to the WWF when the heat dies down. Brian Moran. Response for Dave Meltzer. Dr. Pepper 7-Up pulled out of advertising on All Pro Wrestling, not just WWF, and it had nothing to do with a WWF angle with Stevie Richards but because they didn't want to be associated with the current product. No angle like that is going to make a sponsor pull out. What may and probably will make more sponsors pull out is angles that wave a bullseye at people who have been effective at making sponsors pull out, and continually providing them with ammunition that is effective in making your product appear to be something that sponsors, who usually never look farther than impressive demographics, don't want to associate themselves with. For decades pro wrestling had a negative stigma among heavyweight advertisers that was finally taken away in recent years when it became acceptable mainstream entertainment. So now the negative stigma is coming back. In the past, the negative stigma wasn't a concern because they made their money selling tickets and didn't make money off TV advertising, so it was the local station's problem if they had this highly rated show they had sell time for bargain basement prices. And it's also why, even with high ratings, then wrestling promotions had to buy TV time in many markets almost similar to an infomercial today. If that period were to come back, and now TV advertising is a far more important part of each company's bottom line, and both WCW and WWF have suffered major hits in the last 6 months, both companies will only be able to blame themselves. The PTC has zero power and zero evidence to present its cases to advertisers unless pro wrestling gives them that power. If they just had a presentation of lame, inoffensive material that only religious zealots would overreact to, they'd have been totally ineffective in getting advertisers to pull out. I don't like the methodology of how they handle their approach, but they have the right to do so, and the WWF has provided them with plenty of substance for their arguments, and I do agree with their stance as it pertains to the 1998-99 version of WWF being inappropriate for young children, a statement Vince McMahon himself said on many occasions, and yet being one of the most popular TV shows for young children, and the hypocrisy of Linda McMahon claiming the company doesn't market to children. The PTC is totally hypocritical on the Dr. Laura front as well. I can't say they are with the Toys R Us link because as soon as it was brought to their attention, they dropped the link to their store along with the links of several other companies that sell WWF products. When they present a strong enough case for their viewpoint at a board meeting for their side as to elicit a standing ovation from a huge stockholders meeting, as they did at the MeWorld.com stockholders meeting, wrestling fans can't bury their heads in the sand and fail to recognize at least part of the blame has to be placed directly on the WWF for giving them the evidence that gave them the power to present such a well-received presentation. If you want to applaud the WWF for giving them more incentive to work harder and think that is any kind of a positive for wrestling, it's only a positive in the long run for making wrestling more tame. The thing that gets me is how Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler fall all over themselves talking about freedom of speech and whatnot. What the PTC is doing, although I disagree with them, is perfectly constitutional as well as legal. It's ridiculous for WWF to act like they're the victims of an unconstitutional activity. Matt Plunk. I have mixed feelings about Vince McMahon thumbing his nose at the PTC and the sponsors who have pulled out. As a stockholder, I'd have wanted McMahon to back off and make friends with his detractors. As a private citizen, I applaud his efforts because I can't stand what the PTC stands for. Since I don't own his stock, go for it. Jason Campbell. Steroids in NFL. Alex Merveth's letter on steroids in the NFL made me chuckle and is exactly the type of thing I've talked about when I've said pro wrestling is held to a different standard. I cover the NFL for various websites and the Football Network. Now, I haven't reached the same level of success that Merveth has in his career, but I am in the same locker rooms with the same access. I haven't seen rampant steroid abuse or even minimal steroid abuse either, but I'm also not gullible. Does Merveth expect the abuse to be flaunted? Just look at the NFL offensive linemen who have now reached an average weight of more than 300 pounds. For Merveth to believe this many men in America have the genetic makeup to reach 300 pounds and bench in excess of 400 to 500 pounds is comical and shows a basic lack of understanding of the human body and weightlifting. I played at the Division II level for a small East Coast college and steroids were easily obtainable. One player during my years there played in the NFL for 10 seasons. He entered college the same year as I did and weighed 230 pounds. 5 years later, he was 305 pounds. Guess what? He took steroids. He maintained that weight throughout his NFL career and was never suspended by the NFL for any drug-related activities. In the 1970s, it wasn't unusual to see offensive linemen who weighed 240 pounds. Mick Tingelhoff, the 6-time All-Pro center for the Minnesota Vikings, was listed at 240 and was closer to 225. A 225-pound center wouldn't even get a look from NFL scouts today. I know nutrition and training methods have improved greatly. A lot of the weight and strength gains are due to that. But still, let's now overlook the problem. Steroids remain a problem today not only in pro wrestling, but in the NFL, Major League Baseball, the NHL and track and field. When someone's physique changes rapidly in wrestling, we are all quick to point out it's most likely thanks to the aid of some sort of physique-enhancing drug use. More often than not, we'd be right. In football, they aren't looking for a physique, but they are looking for overall body strength. The means of getting there are often the same. Tim Green, a former Atlanta Falcon, wrote in a 1996 book called The Dark Side of the Game acknowledging steroids were rampant in the 1970s and 1980s. Steroids weren't tested for in the NFL until 1987, so the wrestling excuse of we did it when they were legal is often used. In 1987, the drug use just went underground. Green detailed how Eric Moore of the New York Giants and Mark Duckins of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers were indicted by the DEA for trafficking steroids in 1993. The DEA seized enough steroids from the two players to supply 2 NFL teams. Isn't that a coincidence? He also detailed in the book the lengths some players would go to pass the piss test, including catheterizing clean urine into their bladders. Steroids are a societal problem, and pointing out their abuse in a joke sport like pro wrestling isn't going to get anyone to notice. Pointing out their abuse in pro football might have an impact. But fans, and even many media members, just want to see their games every Sunday, no matter what abuses the players have to go through to play them. John McMullen. Graham. I was looking at Billy Graham's website and, quite frankly, was confused. Here is a man that has denounced his steroid use and spoken very negatively about the effects. He often sounds like he regrets all the years he was on the gas. It always sounded like he was sincere, but the reality is that he wasn't. If he was, his website wouldn't be plastered with all those pictures of him on the juice. By posting those pictures, he is glorifying his drug use. And also he lists wrestlers that he has influenced and has photos of them on the juice: Hulk Hogan, Scott Steiner, Jesse Ventura, etc. He is taking pride in the fact that these guys on steroids were following his example. This is like Wilt Chamberlain coming out and saying he was wrong to have slept around with all those women, and then post photos of himself with all kinds of different women, and then talking about how he's influenced so many others to live the same kind of a lifestyle. I don't think his actions truly reflect a change of heart. Trent Walters. I'm writing because I was listening to your show and heard the email criticizing Billy Graham's site as glorifying steroids. Not surprisingly, I wholeheartedly disagree with the writer's premise. The many photos on Billy's site are there to celebrate his career, as well as educate new fans as to who he was, while providing some nostalgia for his older fans, not to glorify steroid abuse. Using your listeners' logic, if we posted any photos of Graham, it would be glorifying his steroid abuse. In regards to the section of the site that highlights wrestlers that Graham directly influenced, the writer selectively omitted non-steroid abusers like Ric Flair and Steve Austin that are also featured in the section. But realistically, given the fact that 95% of all major pro wrestlers since 1980 have at one point tried steroids, to select wrestlers that were influenced by Graham but had never used steroids would have been virtually impossible. That's not the point of the feature anyway. The physique is, and always was, only part of the equation. The wrestlers that this reader is citing as examples of glorifying steroids took much more from Graham's wrestling persona than just his steroid-enhanced body. It was the clothing, the promos, the ring mannerisms, etc. that the website feature in question highlights, not their bodies. That feature on the site was created before Billy even got involved in the web page and was originally designed as a way to add date to the site. Filler, for lack of a better term. I've been considering taking it down anyway. Perhaps I should. Then again, I find myself asking why. What's so bad about it? Steve Slagle. www.superstarbillygraham.com. Russo. A few days ago, a friend of mine and I were discussing the Andy Kaufman movie, Man on the Moon, and it came up about when Andy and Bob Zmuda were making jokes that only the two of them thought were funny. Then I realized what Vince Russo was doing. Russo can be very creative, but at the same time, he's presented some of the most illogical angles in the history of pro wrestling. As I was watching Nitro and Thunder this past week with both the Kevin Nash and Bill Goldberg shoot interviews on Thunder, I couldn't help but think, this is just like the Kaufman movie. What I mean is Russo books to entertain himself. He's so into the backstage politics and the internet that he thinks everyone is, and doesn't realize that only 2% of the television audience even knew what the hell it was Nash was talking about or who he was taking about. I can just imagine the people at home watching this thinking, who is Brad Siegel? Hopefully Russo will spend as much effort helping turn WCW around and entertaining the other 98% who watch wrestling to suspend their disbelief for 2 hours. Chad Johnson. I'm not opposed to the idea of doing supposed shoot interviews in the middle of a worked wrestling show. But that Goldberg interview was so incredibly stupid. Goldberg basically laughed at the idea that Nash could compete with him in a shoot environment, and made fun of both his age and his knees, totally downplayed the actual worked wrestling that WCW puts on. The implication is that this match will be a shoot. As if. But everything else we see is just a work. I hardly see why WCW wants to downplay the significance of worked matches when that is the product they are putting out. Nobody believes this is going to be a shoot. Even if they did, that's a dumb reason to bury the rest of your product. Admitting wrestling is a work is one thing. Making worked wrestling seem unimportant in comparison to real shooting when your product isn't real shooting is quite another. Then again, the WWF's Godfather turn is just as dumb. If the Godfather is a heel for succumbing to the pressure from Steven Richards and the censors, then what does that make the WWF itself, which did as is continuing to do the same thing? Todd Martin. Discovery Channel. I'm an independent wrestler out of Pennsylvania and saw the Discovery Channel special. I know what independent wrestling is. What was portrayed on the show was definitely not really what it is like. To me, every wrestler on the show was too big and too good looking. The ring was too nice. The camp was too clean. The fact they had a charter bus was ridiculous. Tyler James. It's incredible. The Discovery Channel special made me care more about Sadist, Looney Lane, Big Time and Prototype in 1 hour than any character in WCW over the past 4 months I've watched Nitro. Steve Bushert. Springville, Indiana. Frank Gotch. I'm on the side of the people who believe that pro wrestling has always been predetermined, but I'm growing tired of hearing about how the famed Frank Gotch vs. Fred Beal ring post match of December 1, 1906 proves it was a work. Because there was no ring post. Beal was outweighed by 50 pounds in the match, but from all I've read, he was one of the greatest wrestlers of his era. This is how the finish of the match was reported in the Chicago Tribune of December 2, 1906. Both men were out for blood during the second bout, fall. Beal, who is as wiry as they make them, was full of tricks and by his waiting game gradually tired his big opponent. Beal secured this fall in 39 minutes. When the third bout, fall, was called, it was seen Gotch was weakening. It was short and sweet. Beal tossed Gotch over the mat, the latter striking his head on the bare floor with a blow that rendered him unconscious. Gotch was carried out of the ring and restoratives applied. When he returned, he was apparently dazed and Beal quickly took the winning fall. Gotch says he was not in good physical condition, having taken too many matches in close succession. There is no post. In 1906, a lot of the matches didn't have rings as we know them. They wrestled on mats. Gotch was not counted out. He came back and was beaten in the ring. And Gotch won the rematch? How does that prove it was a work or a pro wrestling angle? It sounds more like Antonio Inoki losing the IWGP title to Hulk Hogan. Was that a work? I believe the ring post story came from Nat Fleischers from Milo to Londos, and was retold in The Fall Guys, all around 30 years later. The finish of the match is written in Frank A. Gotch, World Champion Wrestling, by George Robbins in 1913 doesn't mention a ring post. I've also found an interview that Gotch gave in Los Angeles 11 years later to reporters during a build-up for a match with Joe Stecker, which never took place. He claimed that he was thrown into an orchestra pit because there were no ropes to break his fall. I don't buy his story, but it does confirm there was no ring post. I believe pro wrestling has been worked since before 1840 in France, but the Gotch-Beal match isn't proof of it because it was based on history written 30 years after it happened and the history was wrong. Steve Yohei. Alhambra, California. Response for Dave Meltzer. I'm pretty sure that Inoki Hogan was a work that everyone bought at the time. I believe many years later it came out when Shinma and Inoki had their split that it was Inoki's greatest angle because every mainstream media outlet bought the finish as being real and it was front page news everywhere at the time.